I woke up in a hospital bed trapped inside my own body, unable to move a single muscle. My husband was sitting right next to me, but he was not crying. He was calmly drinking coffee with his mistress and looking at his watch. I thought I was living a nightmare until he leaned over and whispered a $42 million deadline for my death. If I did not expire by tomorrow night, they would lose everything. They thought I was brain dead. They had no idea my mind was entirely intact, and I was already calculating how to destroy them. The first thing that registered was the rhythmic mechanical hiss of a ventilator, then the sharp scent of clinical bleach cutting through a sickeningly sweet wave of vanilla perfume. I tried to open my eyes. Nothing happened. I tried to twitch my index finger. Nothing. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my limbs, pinning me to the mattress. Panic is a useless human emotion, so I shut it down immediately. I am the founder and lead architect of a data intelligence firm. My brain is wired for crisis management. I ran a systemic diagnostic of my own body. Heart rate steady, auditory processing functional, motor controls completely offline. I was experiencing locked-in syndrome. A voice broke through the hum of the machines. It was Savannah. She was the junior acquisitions associate I had hired 14 months ago. "This hospital coffee tastes like battery acid." She sighed, and the sound of a paper cup hitting a plastic tray echoed near my right ear. "How long are we supposed to just sit here, Julian?" My husband of 8 years did not shush her. He did not sound like a grieving man sitting vigil beside his dying wife. His voice was flat and clinical. "Keep your voice down and check the corridor," Julian commanded. I heard the soft squeak of Savannah's rubber-soled shoes moving toward the door. The latch clicked. The biometric lock on her $42 million offshore trust resets in 48 hours. Julian stated, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "If she does not die by tomorrow, the board triggers the succession clause. Once that happens, her shares are locked into a blind trust, and I get nothing but the standard spousal maintenance package. I am not walking away from 8 years of marriage with a pathetic $200,000 annual stipend. I lay there, trapped in the dark, processing the data. 8 years of marriage, 2,920 days of shared history, all of it reduced to a 48-hour expiration date and a $42 million payout. There was no internal monologue about heartbreak. There were no tears welling behind my paralyzed eyelids. There was only the cold, hard math of betrayal. Julian was a mid-level real estate broker when I met him. I built my company from a folding table in a studio apartment into a firm that handled predictive analytics for Fortune 500 companies. I bought his custom suits. I funded his vanity investment projects. I even paid for the platinum Rolex currently ticking on his wrist. And now he was standing over my supposedly lifeless body, treating my death like a corporate merger. Savannah walked back toward the bed. "But the doctor said her brain activity is minimal, Julian. What if she just stays like this? What if she lingers for a week? We cannot access the Cayman accounts without her retinal scan or her thumbprint." Julian exhaled sharply, the sound of a man annoyed by an inconvenience rather than devastated by a tragedy. "That is exactly why we need to move fast. The primary accounts are frozen pending the medical review, but the secondary ledger on her encrypted phone is still accessible. We just need to wait for the shift change. When the nurses leave for their rotation, we handle the biometrics ourselves. We transfer the 15 million liquid assets to the Delaware shell company before the board even realizes what is happening. A shell company in Delaware. $15 million in liquid capital. They had this meticulously planned. Savannah was not just a mistress. She was an accomplice. They had likely been siphoning minor funds for months, testing the security protocols of my secondary accounts. But the offshore trust was the grand prize. The $42 million sitting in the Cayman account was protected by a proprietary biometric firewall I designed myself. It required a live retinal scan and a thermal thumbprint. If my heart stopped, the thermal signature would fail. They needed me alive just long enough to steal the money, but dead quickly enough to prevent the board from activating the succession protocol. My mind raced through the legal and financial ramifications. If Julian successfully wired the $15 million to a Delaware LLC, he would instantly violate federal banking regulations. But without proof of his intent, the transaction could be framed as a legitimate business expense executed by a husband acting as medical proxy. I needed to block the transfer, but I was trapped inside a useless shell of flesh and bone. The monitor beside my bed beeped steadily, matching the rhythm of my racing thoughts. I could not scream. I could not move, but I could listen. Every word they spoke was a piece of evidence. Every detail of their plan was a weapon I would eventually use to dismantle their entire existence. Julian adjusted his chair, dragging it closer to the bed. I felt the warmth of his breath against my cheek. He leaned in close. His voice dropped to a whisper intended only for me, even though he believed I could not hear a thing. "You always had to be the smartest person in the room, Victoria." Julian sneered. "You always had to control every single variable. But you failed to account for this one. You're going to die in this bed, and I am going to take everything you built." I felt a cold, sterile rag wipe across my forehead. Savannah was playing the role of the dutiful nurse in case anyone walked past the window. "We have less than 2 days, Julian," Savannah whispered. Her voice trembled slightly, with a mix of fear and greedy anticipation. "Are you sure the paralytic will hold her under until then?" The word echoed in my mind, paralytic. I had not suffered a random medical emergency. I had not had a stroke. I was poisoned. My husband had dosed me with a chemical agent designed to mimic a catastrophic neurological event. Julian stood up. His leather shoes tapped against the linoleum floor. "It is a synthetic neurotoxin. It is untraceable in standard blood panels. By the time they figure out what happened, she will be ash in an urn and we will be on a private flight to Zurich." The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying precision. A synthetic neurotoxin, a 48-hour window, a biometric heist. They had calculated every angle except one. They did not realize that locking me inside my own head was the worst mistake they could have possibly made. Deprived of physical movement, my brain redirected all its energy into pure, unadulterated, tactical planning. I was not a victim waiting to die. I was an apex predator trapped in a cage, gathering the exact coordinates of my prey. The door handle clicked again. Heavy footsteps entered the room. The sterile smell of the hospital was suddenly masked by the scent of strong coffee and old paper. The shift change was over. The game was about to begin. The heavy wooden door of the intensive care unit swung open, cutting off the sterile silence of my room. Footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum floor. It was Dr. Iris Thorne, the lead neurologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The moment the brass hinges creaked, Julian underwent a physiological transformation that would have won him an Academy Award. His spine curled forward. His broad shoulders slumped. He buried his face in his hands, rubbing his eyes violently until the sclera turned a credible shade of bloodshot pink. Savannah seamlessly transitioned from a greedy co-conspirator to a deeply concerned junior colleague. She stepped away from my bed, crossing her arms and casting her eyes downward in a perfect display of respectful corporate mourning. I watched this entire theatrical production through the tiny microscopic slit of my unblinking eyelids. Julian reached out and grabbed my limp, paralyzed hand, squeezing it with desperate affection. He took a ragged, calculated breath, preparing to deliver his lines. "Dr. Thorne, what is the latest?" Julian asked, his voice cracking with artificial grief. "Please tell me there is some brain activity. Tell me my wife is still in there. We have a $50 million acquisition launching next week, and she needs to be here for it." Dr. Thorne did not offer a sympathetic smile. He did not hold a clipboard of pity. He did not step forward to check my vitals or pat my husband on the shoulder. Instead, he turned around and pushed the heavy steel button on the door handle. The deadbolt engaged with a loud and absolute click. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Julian froze. His thumb stopped tracing circles on my paralyzed hand. Savannah shifted her weight nervously, her expensive designer stiletto tapping once against the floor. Dr. Thorne walked to the foot of my bed and opened a sealed manila folder stamped with the hospital laboratory seal. He did not look at Julian. He looked directly at my face, as if he knew my mind was entirely intact and listening to every word. "I just received the secondary toxicology screen from the state laboratory." Thorne said, his voice stripped of any bedside manner. "This was not a spontaneous vascular event. The stroke was not caused by a blood clot, an aneurysm, or any natural biological failure." Julian stood up slowly, releasing my hand, letting it drop onto the mattress. "What are you talking about?" he asked. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, a microscopic tell of his rising panic. Your wife is currently suffering from a chemically induced state of total physical paralysis. Thorne continued flipping to the second page of the report. The laboratory isolated a synthetic neuromuscular paralytic in her spinal fluid. It is a highly specialized compound designed to entirely bypass the blood-brain barrier and sever the motor cortex from the peripheral nervous system. It mimics the symptoms of a catastrophic brainstem stroke perfectly. But it is absolutely not a stroke. Someone introduced this highly toxic chemical into her system. The room went completely still. Even the rhythmic mechanical hum of the ventilator seemed to fade into the background. I felt a surge of cold, triumphant clarity wash over my paralyzed body. Julian had thought he was a criminal genius purchasing an untraceable black market toxin. He had severely underestimated the relentless analytical precision of a top-tier research hospital. This is a targeted, intentional poisoning, Dr. Thorne stated flatly, closing the folder. Given the malicious nature of the compound and the high-profile financial status of your wife, I am legally mandated to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I have already drafted the preliminary medical report. The Bureau will send a forensic team to secure this room as an active crime scene within the hour. Savannah let out a sharp, audible gasp. It was a genuine reaction, born of pure, unadulterated terror. She took a step backward, bumping into the metal tray table. If the federal agents locked down the room, they would never get my thumbprint. They would never get the retinal scan. The $15 million Delaware shell company would remain empty, and the $42 million offshore trust would be completely out of their reach. I watched Julian closely. For exactly 3 seconds, he stared at the doctor in absolute utter silence. His mind was running through a million different escape routes. He was trapped, and he knew it. But Julian was a survivor born of his own massive arrogance. He swallowed hard, forcing his heart rate to steady. He put both hands on his hips and let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head in a masterful display of tragic realization. "Oh my God," Julian whispered, closing his eyes. "Oh, Victoria, what did you do?" Dr. Thorne narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." Julian looked up at the doctor with an expression of profound, devastating defeat. "She did this to herself, doctor. Victoria is the founder and chief executive of a massive data intelligence firm. The pressure she puts on herself is literally inhuman. She works 120-hour weeks. For the last 6 months, she has been obsessing over maximizing her cognitive output. She started ordering unverified synthetic nootropics from unregulated overseas laboratories. I screamed inside my own mind. It was a brilliant and absolutely devastating lie. Julian was weaponizing my massive ambition against me. Silicon Valley tech founders were notorious for experimenting with dangerous cognitive enhancers and microdosing unregulated chemicals to stay awake. He was painting me as a reckless workaholic who accidentally poisoned herself in the arrogant pursuit of corporate perfection. She had these unmarked vials delivered directly to our Chicago penthouse. Julian continued, his voice gaining steady confidence. She called it a proprietary focus stack. I begged her to stop taking them. I told her it was incredibly dangerous to inject synthetic compounds she bought on the dark web. But she never listens to me. She said it was the only way to keep her brain functioning ahead of the market competition. She must have miscalculated a dose. You do not need to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation, doctor. This is not an attempted murder. This is a tragic, stupid accident caused by a stubborn woman who pushed her biology way too far. Dr. Thorne stared at Julian, evaluating the elaborate lie. The story fit the demographic profile perfectly. High-net-worth tech executives frequently engaged in highly risky biohacking. It provided a very plausible alternative to domestic homicide. "I understand your position," Julian Thorne said slowly. "However, the chemical signature of this paralytic is highly unusual and incredibly dangerous. I cannot simply write this off as a biohacking experiment gone wrong without an independent verification." Julian stepped closer to the doctor, lowering his voice into a tone of man-to-man reason. "Think about the press, doctor. If the FBI storms this hospital investigating the attempted murder of a prominent chief executive, it will be an absolute media circus. The stock of her company will plummet 30% by tomorrow morning. Hundreds of innocent people will lose their jobs over a rumor. Just give me time to bring her personal medical files from the penthouse. Let me show you the financial receipts for the cognitive enhancers she was buying." Dr. Thorne considered the request carefully. His primary concern was medical accuracy, not corporate public relations, but he also knew the massive danger of making a false murder accusation against a wealthy, influential family. I will delay the formal FBI notification for exactly 12 hours. Thorne finally conceded. I am ordering a specialist review of the compound. A senior toxicologist will arrive from Chicago tomorrow morning to examine the lab results and compare them against whatever supplements you claim she was taking. But until then, nobody else enters this room. And if that specialist cannot confirm your theory, the bureau gets called immediately. Julian nodded solemnly. Thank you, doctor. That is all I ask. Just 12 hours to clear her name. Dr. Thorne turned and unlocked the door, leaving the room without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, Savannah collapsed into the visitor chair, trembling violently. Julian did not comfort her. He stared down at me with cold, dead eyes. The clock was ticking. He had exactly 12 hours to forge my medical records, drain my accounts, and make sure I never woke up to tell the exact truth. As soon as the heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving us alone in the sterile room, the facade of the grieving husband instantly vanished. Julian spun away from the door and ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair. The careful composure he maintained in front of the doctor shattered into a million jagged pieces of pure panic. We do not have 48 hours anymore, he hissed, pacing the short distance between my life support monitor and the window. We have 12 hours before a federal toxicologist walks through that door and realizes I bought a military-grade paralytic. Once the bureau gets involved, every single asset she owns will be locked down in a federal freeze. Savannah was visibly trembling now. Her pristine corporate posture collapsed as she leaned heavily against the metal tray table. She looked at my paralyzed body like I was a ticking time bomb instead of a human being. They will check the security cameras, Julian. She stammered, her voice tight with rising hysteria. They will see me walking in here. They will look at the offshore trust and know we tried to trigger the succession clause. We need to leave right now. We need to get on a plane before the doctor changes his mind and calls the feds early. Julian stopped pacing and glared at her with absolute contempt. We are not running away with empty pockets, he snapped. The $42 million in the Cayman account is a lost cause now. We cannot risk the board finding out before the transfer clears. But the secondary ledger is still completely viable. There is $15 million in liquid capital sitting in her private corporate account. The federal freeze has not happened yet. We are taking that money right now. Julian walked over to my personal belongings bag, sitting on the small plastic chair in the corner of the room. He dumped my belongings onto the floor looking for one specific item. He snatched up my encrypted private ledger phone. It was a custom-built device encased in solid titanium designed specifically to authorize massive corporate transactions without triggering standard banking delays. It held the key to my entire secondary financial portfolio. Savannah watched him with wide, terrified eyes. How are we supposed to unlock it? She asked. She's totally paralyzed. She cannot type the alphanumeric passcode. Julian walked to the side of my bed and looked down at me with cold calculation. We do not need her to type anything, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. The phone needs a retinal scan and a live thermal thumbprint. Come over here and hold her head steady. Savannah hesitated, stepping back toward the wall. I do not want to touch her, Julian, she whispered. This is insane. This is federal wire fraud. If we get caught doing this in a hospital room, we are going to federal prison for the rest of our lives. Julian grabbed her by the arm and yanked her forward. We are already going to prison if that toxicologist tests her blood. He growled directly into her face. This is our only exit strategy. When the $15 million hits the Delaware Shell Company, we are untouchable. Now get over here and open her eyes. Savannah moved to the right side of my bed. I could smell the sharp, metallic scent of her nervous sweat cutting through her expensive vanilla perfume. She pushed her trembling thumbs forcefully against my brow bone, pulling my eyelids completely open. The harsh hospital lights burned my retinas, but I could not blink. I could not turn my head away. I was forced to stare straight up as Julian leaned over me, holding the titanium phone directly above my face. The glowing screen illuminated his sharp features, casting dark shadows across his eyes. He tapped the screen to activate the retinal scanner. a bright red laser grid projected out from the camera lens, sweeping across my exposed right eye. I felt an intense, invasive vulnerability as the machine read the unique patterns of my iris. The scanner demanded a living subject, and my violently beating heart provided the necessary biological proof. A sharp digital chime echoed in the quiet room, confirming the first layer of security was breached. Savannah let go of my face, gasping for air, as if she had just been suffocated. My eyelids remained open, exposing me to the blinding light and the terrifying reality of my own complete physical helplessness. Julian did not even pause to celebrate. He immediately moved to the next phase of his meticulously planned robbery. He grabbed my right wrist, lifting my limp arm off the mattress. My skin was pale and cold, but the blood was still pumping perfectly through my veins. He pressed my thumb firmly against the glass sensor at the bottom of the screen. I felt the smooth, cold surface of the phone bite into my skin. Another digital chime rang out, unlocking the main financial dashboard. Julian exhaled a sharp breath of relief. "We are in," he muttered, his fingers flying rapidly across the glass screen. He navigated directly to the secondary corporate holding account. I lay there, staring blankly at the ceiling, completely paralyzed, while my husband liquidated my life work. "I need the routing number for the Delaware Shell Company," he demanded, not looking up from the screen. Savannah pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her blazer pocket, reading the numbers aloud in a shaky whisper. Julian typed them in, but he muttered them back to confirm the sequence. Routing number 0210000089. Account 45982210. I memorized every single digit, locking them deep inside my mind. $15 million, he whispered, initiating the wire transfer. The heavy titanium phone buzzed once. The money was gone. Julian dropped my arm back onto the bed. "Now we walk out," he said coldly. Julian barely had time to slide my custom titanium phone back into my belongings bag before the heavy hospital door swung open again. He spun around, expecting the federal toxicologist to be standing there, but the man filling the doorway was an entirely different kind of threat. It was Marcus. My sister's husband was a senior forensic auditor at a major financial institution. He was a tall, brilliantly sharp African-American man who operated with the ruthless precision of a military general. He did not tolerate fools, and he despised Julian with a quiet, burning passion. Marcus was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying his signature locked leather briefcase. He stepped into the room, absorbing the tense atmosphere, the faint smell of sweat, and the guilty posture of my husband and his mistress in less than a second. "What are you doing here?" Marcus, Julian demanded, taking a step forward to physically block the path to my bed. "This is an intensive care unit. The doctor specifically said family members only. You need to leave right now before I call hospital security to have you escorted out of the building." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not flinch or take a single step backward. He looked at Julian the exact same way he looked at a fraudulent corporate tax return. "You are right, Julian," Marcus said, his voice deep and completely devoid of warmth. "Family only. And as of 40 minutes ago, that definition legally excludes your sole authority over her medical care." Marcus reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a deeply folded piece of thick legal paper. He extended his arm, holding the document inches from Julian's face. "This is an emergency medical proxy injunction signed by a federal circuit judge," Marcus explained calmly. "My wife, your sister-in-law, petitioned the court the moment we received the hospital admission alert. Given your historical lack of medical knowledge and your sudden proximity to her primary financial assets, the judge granted a temporary override. I am now legally recognized as her co-proxy. You cannot make a single medical or financial decision without my physical signature. Now step aside." Julian snatched the paper from his hand, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal jargon. I could see the muscles in his neck straining. The $15 million wire transfer was already processing, but this injunction meant Marcus had the legal right to request a complete audit of my accounts immediately. Savannah shrank against the far wall, trying to make herself entirely invisible. She knew exactly who Marcus was, and she knew he could destroy her entire career with a single phone call to the regulatory board. "This is completely absurd," Julian spat, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I am her husband. I hold the primary power of attorney. You cannot just barge in here and take over her life. I am going to call my corporate lawyers and have this injunction thrown out within the hour." You are welcome to try, Marcus replied, stepping smoothly around Julian and approaching the side of my bed. But until a federal judge strikes it down, you are required to give me unhindered access to the patient. The court order mandates a private medical assessment. That means I get 3 minutes alone with her right now. Both of you need to step out into the hallway immediately, or I will have the federal marshals enforce the injunction and drag you out. Julian glared at Marcus, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He knew he was trapped by the legal maneuvering. He shot a venomous look at my paralyzed form and then turned sharply on his heel. "Come on, Savannah," he barked. "We are going to the cafeteria to make some urgent phone calls." Savannah practically sprinted out of the room, eager to escape the suffocating presence of the forensic auditor. Julian followed her, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him. The room fell into a heavy, absolute silence. Marcus stood at the foot of my bed, his dark eyes scanning the complex medical monitors, the intravenous lines, and the terrible, unnatural stillness of my body. He did not offer any empty words of comfort. He did not shed a tear. He knew me too well for that. He knew I was a fighter, and he suspected something was deeply wrong with this entire scenario. I focused every single ounce of my available neurological energy on my right eye. For the past 20 minutes, I had been fighting the chemical blockade in my brain, desperately trying to force a signal through the synthetic paralytic. The immense anger of watching Julian steal my money had triggered a massive internal surge of adrenaline. I visualized the neural pathways pushing past the toxic barrier. I felt a tiny microscopic twitch in my facial muscles. It was agonizingly slow, but the heavy curtain of total paralysis was finally beginning to crack. Marcus stepped closer to my face. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice steady and deadly serious. "If you are in there, give me a sign. Anything at all." I gathered all my strength and forced my right eyelid to slide downward. It was a heavy, deliberate blink. I held my eyes shut for a full second before letting it flutter open again. Marcus froze. He leaned in, inches from my face, his eyes locking entirely onto mine. He did not gasp in shock. He did not frantically call for the hospital nurses. He recognized the intentional, deliberate movement immediately. We had established a highly classified corporate crisis protocol years ago when my company first went public. It was a fail-safe communication method designed strictly for extreme ransom or corporate kidnapping scenarios. We both knew international Morse code perfectly. I took a mental breath and began to speak through the only muscle I could currently control. I held my eyelids shut for a long beat. Dash. I opened it. Dash. I blinked rapidly. The letter T. I paused and began the next sequence. 3 long blinks. The letter O. I moved through the pattern with agonizing precision, fighting the deep exhaustion tearing through my skull. Dash, dot, dot, dash. The letter X, dot, dot. The letter I, dash, dot. The letter N, toxin. Marcus stood perfectly still, absorbing the terrifying word. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained a mask of pure professional stone. I did not stop. I immediately began the next word, knowing my time was rapidly running out before Julian returned to the room. Dot, dot, dash, dot. F, dot, dash, dot. R, dot, dash. A, dot, dot, dash. U, dash, dot, dot. D, fraud. The message was delivered perfectly. Toxin. Fraud. In 2 simple words, I had given him the entire blueprint of my attempted murder and the massive ongoing financial theft. I had given the forensic auditor the exact precise coordinates of the crime. Marcus did not waste any precious time asking redundant questions. He simply nodded his head once, a subtle gesture of absolute understanding and lethal intent. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out his heavily encrypted tactical tablet. He powered it on the screen, casting a pale blue light across his stern-focused features. I watched as his fingers began to fly rapidly across the digital keyboard, launching deep diagnostic sweeps and initiating secure communication channels with his financial crime unit. Julian thought he had won the game by paralyzing my physical body. He had absolutely no idea I had just unleashed the most dangerous weapon in my corporate arsenal. Marcus was officially at war, and I was finally fighting back. Julian was cornered, but a cornered animal is often the most dangerous. The 12-hour window Dr. Thorne had granted him was rapidly closing. The federal toxicologist was scheduled to arrive at Northwestern Memorial Hospital exactly at 9 in the morning. If that specialist drew my blood inside the highly monitored intensive care unit, Julian would be in federal custody by noon. He needed me out of the hospital and away from the cameras immediately. The medical proxy injunction Marcus had slapped him with was formidable, but Julian had spent 8 years watching my corporate lawyers exploit legal loopholes. He knew the injunction required Marcus to sign off on active life-saving medical treatments. It did not explicitly prohibit discharging a terminal patient for end-of-life palliative care. At exactly 4 in the morning, Julian executed his pivot. He woke the on-call hospital administrator and presented aggressively forged psychiatric evaluations, claiming I had a severe clinical phobia of hospitals. He leveraged his status as my legal husband to invoke the right to die with dignity. He demanded an immediate home hospice transfer. By the time Marcus was notified by the hospital registry, the private ambulance was already loading my paralyzed body onto a transport stretcher. Julian had bribed the private transport company with $10,000, transferred directly from my secondary checking account, to expedite the process without asking a single question. I felt the cold morning air of Chicago hit my face as they wheeled me out of the loading bay. The ambulance ride was a masterclass in psychological torture. Julian sat in the back with me, staring intensely at his phone and aggressively deleting his encrypted search history. He did not hold my hand. He did not speak a single word to the paramedics. He just kept checking the time, calculating exactly how many hours he had left to finish the job before Marcus could file an emergency restraining order with a federal judge. We arrived at my 6,000-square-foot penthouse on the Gold Coast just as the morning sun began to reflect off Lake Michigan. I had purchased this property entirely in cash with my first major tech buyout. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the custom marble floors, the automated climate control were all testaments to my relentless work ethic. Now my husband was going to use it as my personal execution chamber. The paramedics transferred me to a sterile, automated medical bed that Julian had hastily rented. He directed them to position it directly in the center of my massive living room. As soon as the transport team left and the private elevator doors closed, the front door opened again. It was Savannah. She was not wearing her usual tailored corporate blazer and pristine pencil skirt. She was wearing a crisp white set of medical scrubs, holding a vintage leather medical bag she had likely purchased from a theatrical supply store. She had legally registered herself through a fraudulent shell agency as my private palliative nurse. It was a brilliant and utterly disgusting layer of insulation. If Marcus or the Chicago police showed up at the front door, Julian had a documented medical professional on site, administering end-of-life care. It gave Savannah 24-hour access to my home, my private servers, and my dying body without raising immediate suspicion from the building concierge. Savannah walked into the living room and dropped her fake medical bag onto my custom Italian leather sofa. She looked around the penthouse with wide, greedy eyes, taking in the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. "This is absolutely incredible," she whispered, running her hand along the edge of the imported quartz kitchen island. "I cannot believe you get to live like this, Julian. We could sell this place for at least $8 million. He does not live like this," I thought with absolute clarity. I allow him to live like this, but I kept my eyes fixed blankly on the ceiling. My living room was a museum of my own massive success. Directly to my left hung a private collection of contemporary art valued at exactly $120,000. I had curated every single piece personally. Now I was just another silent object in the room, placed on display for their amusement. Julian ignored her comment about the real estate and walked over to my custom mahogany wet bar. He bypassed the standard liquor and reached straight for the top shelf. He pulled down a bottle of Macallan, 25-year-old single malt scotch. It was a $6,000 bottle I had received from a board member after securing our largest data contract with a massive defense contractor. Julian poured 2 heavy glasses neat and handed one to Savannah. "A toast," he said, raising the heavy crystal tumbler, "to a seamless transition of power." Savannah giggled, taking a sip of the rare scotch. She winced at the intense burn, but quickly masked it with a greedy, triumphant smile. They stood directly at the foot of my medical bed, drinking my expensive liquor and discussing my death as if they were planning a casual weekend corporate retreat. "We need to finalize the cremation details," Julian said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I already forged her signature on the advanced directive refusing artificial hydration and nutrition. But we need a local crematorium that processes immediately. I am absolutely not hosting a viewing. If her family sees the body, they might demand a private autopsy, and we cannot risk anyone finding traces of the synthetic paralytic in her tissue. Savannah nodded, pulling her phone out to check her meticulously typed notes. I found a facility in the northern suburbs that offers same-day private processing for a premium fee. We can have her ashes back in a decorative marble urn by tomorrow evening. We can host a tasteful corporate memorial gala on Friday to secure investor confidence before we board the flight to Zurich. I already drafted the press release announcing your appointment as the interim chief executive officer. The board will have no choice but to confirm you once the death certificate is filed. Listening to your husband and your junior employee casually arrange your total incineration is a profoundly sobering experience. They spoke about the absolute destruction of my physical body with the exact same tone they used to discuss fourth quarter profit margins. There was absolutely zero remorse. There was no hesitation. There was only cold logistical execution. But Julian had made a catastrophic miscalculation when he rushed my discharge from the hospital. He assumed the synthetic paralytic would maintain its total suffocating hold over my central nervous system until I simply dehydrated to death in my own living room. He did not account for my hyper-accelerated metabolic rate and the sheer relentless force of human will. Lying completely still in that hospital bed, I had channeled every ounce of my neurological energy into fighting the chemical blockade. The Morse code blink I shared with Marcus was just the beginning of the breach. As Julian and Savannah stood at the foot of my bed drinking my scotch and finalizing the liquidation of my tech empire, I felt a sharp, agonizing prickle of sensation shoot down my left arm. It felt like 1,000 tiny hot needles piercing my skin all at once. It was the absolute most painful and beautiful sensation I had ever experienced in my entire life. The paralysis was officially breaking. The neural pathways were aggressively reconnecting. I could feel the soft Egyptian cotton of the blanket resting against my legs. I could feel the subtle vibration of the heavy bass from the city traffic outside my panoramic window. My motor functions were rapidly returning to baseline. I could flex my fingers. I could turn my neck, but I knew better than to reveal my hand. I was a strategist, and this was a hostage situation. If I moved my arm or turned my head right now, Julian would simply panic. He would grab a decorative pillow from the sofa and smother me to death before the security cameras in the hallway caught anything. I had no physical leverage yet. I had to maintain the absolute illusion of complete, total vulnerability. I locked my muscles down. I slowed my breathing to mimic a failing respiratory system. I watched them toast to my demise while my body quietly prepared for absolute war. Julian finished his glass of 25-year-old scotch and set it down heavily on the marble counter. He looked at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of my living room. It was exactly 6:15 in the morning. They had less than 3 hours before the federal toxicologist realized I was missing from the intensive care unit and triggered a massive manhunt. Julian turned to Savannah, his eyes manic and bloodshot. "Open your laptop," Julian commanded, pointing toward the custom leather sofa where her fake medical bag rested. "We need to drain the secondary corporate accounts right now before Marcus officially registers the medical proxy injunction with the banking institutions. Once that injunction hits the federal clearinghouse, every single account tied to her social security number will be frozen solid." Savannah did not hesitate. She dropped her crystal tumbler onto the counter and rushed to her bag, pulling out a sleek silver laptop. She sat cross-legged on my custom velvet armchair directly in my line of sight. I lay perfectly still in the automated medical bed, regulating my breathing to a slow artificial rhythm. My motor functions were steadily returning, but I kept my body entirely locked down. I watched her boot up the machine through the tiny microscopic slit of my eyelids. She connected to our private home wireless network. That was their first catastrophic mistake. Julian was a real estate broker who thought he understood corporate espionage because he knew how to forge a signature. He had absolutely no idea how digital warfare actually worked. He assumed that because we were inside my heavily fortified penthouse using my private encrypted router, their internet traffic was completely secure. He failed to comprehend the terrifying capability of the man he had just banished from the hospital. Marcus was a senior forensic auditor who hunted international money launderers for a living. The moment Julian had forced my discharge, Marcus knew exactly where they were taking me and exactly what they were going to do. While Julian was busy bribing ambulance drivers, Marcus was sitting in his downtown office executing a hostile digital takeover of my penthouse. I knew the exact architecture of my home network. I had designed it. It featured a dynamic firewall that automatically logged every single unauthorized device. But Marcus did not just log Savannah's laptop. Operating entirely remotely, he hijacked the primary router protocol and created an invisible shadow network. When Savannah clicked the wireless icon and connected to the penthouse internet, she thought she was entering a secure encrypted tunnel. In reality, she had just plugged her laptop directly into a digital interrogation room controlled entirely by my brother-in-law. "I am in the banking portal," Savannah whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The glow of the screen illuminated her pale face. "I am using the authorization tokens we pulled from her titanium phone at the hospital. The system is accepting the biometric handshake." Julian walked up behind her, resting his hands on the back of the velvet chair. "How much liquid capital is available?" he asked, his voice tight with pure greed. Savannah navigated through the complex layers of my corporate holding accounts. These were the secondary funds I used for rapid software acquisitions and emergency payroll reserves. I watched her eyes widen as the dashboard loaded. "There is exactly $2.5 million sitting in the Rapid Deployment Fund." She breathed, her voice trembling slightly. "It is completely unencumbered. No board approval required for transfers under $3 million. She set it up for immediate liquidity." "Transfer it," Julian ordered immediately. "Send it to the Delaware Shell Company right now." "Wait, Julian?" Savannah hesitated, hovering her finger over the trackpad. "Are you absolutely sure about this? The $15 million we wired from the hospital is still pending clearance. If we move another $2.5 million from a separate IP address, it might trigger fraud alert algorithms. What if the bank flags it and locks the destination account?" "We do not have time to worry about algorithms," Julian snapped, leaning over her shoulder and pointing aggressively at the screen. "The $15 million is protected by the medical proxy I signed yesterday. This $2.5 million is our insurance policy. If Marcus freezes the primary assets, we need untraceable cash to pay the Zurich lawyers and fund our exit strategy. Just do it, Savannah. Transfer the money." Savannah swallowed hard, her throat bobbing as she stared at the flashing cursor. I lay in my bed 20 feet away, screaming internally with absolute triumph. I knew exactly what was happening on the back end of that transaction. Savannah initiated the wire transfer. She typed in the routing number for their fraudulent Delaware Shell Company. She entered the exact amount of $2.5 million. She clicked confirm. If Marcus wanted to, he could have blocked that transaction in a millisecond. He had full administrative control over the shadow network. He could have severed the internet connection, crashed her laptop, or locked the banking portal with a catastrophic error code. He could have easily protected my $2.5 million from being stolen. But Marcus was a forensic auditor, and forensic auditors do not play defense. They play for absolute total destruction. Marcus intentionally let the transaction go through. He sat back in his office and watched the data packets stream across his encrypted tablet, allowing Savannah to successfully initiate the transfer. But he did not just let the money leave my account. He actively rerouted the digital pathway of the transaction before it reached the Federal Clearinghouse. My company handled predictive data analytics for massive financial institutions. Because of our high-level government contracts, we maintained a highly classified secondary holding account that was directly monitored by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It was a honeypot. A honeypot is a digital decoy designed specifically to lure cyber criminals into a heavily surveilled trap. Any funds moved into or out of that specific account generated an immediate automated alert to the federal authorities. Marcus took the $2.5 million Savannah was trying to steal and silently pushed it straight through the Securities and Exchange Commission honeypot before sending it onward to their Delaware Shell Company. Julian and Savannah stared at the laptop screen, holding their breath. A small loading wheel spun in the center of the display. The silence in the living room was deafening, broken only by the artificial hiss of my medical ventilator. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. A bright green checkmark appeared on the screen. Transfer complete. Savannah exhaled, slumping back into the velvet chair. Her entire body shook with the massive release of adrenaline. The funds are gone, Julian. We got it. They are in the Delaware account. Julian let out a loud, sharp laugh. He grabbed Savannah by the shoulders and pulled her out of the chair, spinning her around in a celebratory embrace right in the middle of my living room. "We are rich," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "We are completely untouchable. He has nothing on us. Marcus is probably sitting in his office right now crying over his stupid legal injunction while we drain her empire dry." I kept my face perfectly still, staring blankly at the ceiling, but my mind was a terrifying symphony of pure calculated victory. Julian was celebrating his own execution. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had successfully stolen another $2.5 million to fund his luxurious new life. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually done. By taking the money through the shadow network, Julian and Savannah had crossed a massive lethal threshold. Stealing money from a spouse using a forged medical proxy is a complicated domestic legal dispute that can take years to untangle in a civil courtroom. It is messy, and it is entirely reliant on proving cognitive intent. But triggering an unauthorized wire transfer through an account actively monitored by the Securities and Exchange Commission is an entirely different universe of consequence. Marcus had intentionally let them take the bait because the bait was lethally toxic. By clicking that confirm button, Savannah had not just committed standard theft. She had initiated a fraudulent transfer of funds across state lines using a compromised digital network. She and Julian had just committed Class A federal wire fraud. It is a crime carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary per count. And because the funds touched a federally monitored honeypot, the jurisdiction automatically escalated from local police to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There would be no messy divorce proceedings. There would be no lengthy civil litigation over asset division. Marcus had just handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped, digitally authenticated confession of massive financial crimes. Julian walked over to my medical bed, looking down at me with a sickening smile of absolute superiority. He reached out and stroked my hair, acting the part of the devoted husband one last time. "You built a beautiful empire, Victoria," he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and profound arrogance. "I promise I will spend every single penny of it honoring your memory." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let him enjoy his final moments of delusional victory. The trap was set. The vault was locked. The federal tripwire had been officially crossed. My money was completely safe, secured in a federal freeze that Julian would never be able to access. And as I lay there, feeling the strength slowly bleed back into my arms and legs, I knew my resurrection was going to be the most devastating event of his pathetic, miserable life. Julian looked at his heavy platinum Rolex. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. He had exactly 30 minutes before he needed to be in the downtown boardroom to pitch his fraudulent succession plan to my executive team. He was rapidly running out of time. The federal toxicologist would be arriving at the hospital intensive care unit soon. The synthetic paralytic was supposed to shut down my respiratory system naturally by now, but my heart monitor continued to beep with a steady, relentless rhythm. I was refusing to die on his perfectly calculated schedule. Julian walked over to his leather briefcase and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. He handed it directly to Savannah. Her eyes widened as she stared at the small bottle resting in her palm. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It is concentrated potassium chloride," Julian said, his voice completely cold and pragmatic. "It is completely untraceable in a standard post-mortem toxicology screen. It mimics a massive sudden cardiac arrest perfectly. It is the exact same chemical they use for lethal injections, but in a smaller dose, it just looks like her weakened heart finally gave out from the stroke. I need to leave for the board meeting right now to secure my position as the interim chief executive officer. As soon as I step onto the private elevator, I want you to inject 50 milligrams directly into her intravenous line." Savannah shook her head, taking a step back toward the marble kitchen island. "You said the paralytic was enough, Julian. You never said I would have to push the plunger and kill her myself. Julian grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging forcefully into her white medical scrubs. The paralytic is taking way too long, he hissed directly into her face. If she is still breathing when Dr. Thorne realizes she is missing from the hospital, he will send the Chicago police to this penthouse. We have $2.5 million sitting in a Delaware shell company and a $42 million offshore trust waiting for her heart to stop. Do not get weak on me now, Savannah. Draw the dose and push it into the line. Julian grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the living room without looking back. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind him, leaving me completely alone with the woman assigned to be my executioner. Savannah stood frozen in the center of the room, clutching the small glass vial. She walked over to her fake medical bag and pulled out a sterile plastic syringe. Her hands were shaking violently as she pierced the rubber stopper of the vial and slowly pulled back the plunger. She drew exactly 50 milligrams of the lethal clear liquid into the plastic chamber. She tapped the side of the syringe to remove the tiny air bubbles, just like she had seen in the movies. She turned toward my bed, holding the weapon that was supposed to end my life. Suddenly, her cell phone vibrated loudly on the marble counter. Savannah jumped, dropping her hand to her side. She walked over and looked at the caller identification screen. Her greedy expression instantly returned, replacing the fear. It was the luxury realtor from Manhattan, the broker handling the exclusive $10 million penthouse listing they planned to buy with my stolen money. She looked at me lying completely motionless in the medical bed. She figured I was not going anywhere. I will be right back, she whispered to herself. She swiped the screen to answer the call and walked out onto the private terrace, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her to block the wind. I had exactly 2 minutes. The moment the glass door clicked shut, my eyes snapped open. I did not waste a single millisecond. The paralysis in my upper body had fractured just enough to give me crude, heavy motor control. It was agonizing. My muscles screamed in absolute protest, feeling like they were tearing away from the bone as I forced my right arm to lift off the mattress. Every single movement required a massive, monumental effort of absolute sheer will. I reached across my chest toward my left arm where the intravenous line was taped securely to my skin. My fingers were stiff and clumsy, but my mind was violently sharp. I found the small plastic port connecting the main fluid line to the needle in my vein. I twisted the locking mechanism. It clicked and detached. Warm blood welled up slightly at the injection site, but I ignored it. I grabbed the secondary tube, the one Savannah was planning to use for the potassium injection. I pulled it away from my arm and shoved the open end deep underneath my thick mattress pad. I reached out and grabbed the spare saline flush syringe resting on the metal tray table next to my bed. My hand shook with deep exhaustion as I locked the sterile saline syringe directly into the port connected to my vein. I had essentially created a dummy line. When Savannah pushed the lethal potassium, it would flow harmlessly into the expensive foam of my mattress, while the sterile saline would enter my bloodstream. My arm felt like it was made of solid lead. I dropped the real line back onto my chest, hiding the disconnected port beneath the thick folds of my cotton blanket. I let my head fall back onto the pillow. I closed my eyes and instantly locked my breathing back into the shallow rhythmic pattern of a dying woman. I relaxed my facial muscles just as the glass terrace door slid open. Savannah walked back into the living room, slipping her phone into her pocket. She had a massive, satisfied smile on her face. She had just secured a private showing for the luxury property, using the illusion of my massive wealth. She walked over to the side of my bed, picking up the syringe filled with the concentrated potassium chloride. She did not bother to check my vitals. She did not notice the slight smear of blood on my forearm or the subtle, unnatural angle of the intravenous tubing hidden beneath the blanket. She was too blinded by the absolute certainty of her impending rich lifestyle to pay attention to the medical details. She connected the lethal syringe to the plastic port. I felt the slight tug on the tubing, but I remained perfectly, absolutely still. Savannah leaned over me, her vanilla perfume mixed with the sharp clinical scent of the sterile plastic. She pushed the plunger down steadily, injecting the 50 milligrams of clear liquid. I felt absolutely nothing enter my vein. The concentrated potassium was soaking directly into the mattress pad beneath my hip, completely harmless. Savannah pulled the empty syringe away and dropped it onto the tray table. She looked down at my face, her eyes cold and totally devoid of any human empathy. She reached out and patted my cheek exactly the way you would pat a compliant dog. "Goodbye, boss," she whispered, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. I did not twitch. I simply closed my eyes tighter and waited. I let her believe she had just committed the perfect murder. She walked away to pour herself another glass of my expensive scotch to celebrate her ultimate victory. I lay there, feeling the cool, sterile saline flush through my vein, knowing that when Julian walked into that corporate boardroom, he would be standing on a foundation of absolute lies. They thought they had finally stopped my heart, but they had only guaranteed their own absolute total destruction. While Savannah was pouring her celebratory scotch in my living room, Julian was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table inside my corporate headquarters. My company occupied the top 3 floors of the highest skyscraper in the financial district of Chicago. I knew exactly what was happening in that room because I had built the secure boardroom protocols myself from the ground up. Julian was standing in front of my 12 executive board members, holding a black leather folder containing the forged medical power of attorney. He was wearing his custom Italian suit, projecting the highly calculated false image of a grieving but resolute husband taking charge of a tragic situation. He looked down at the men and women I had personally hired and delivered his completely fraudulent pitch. He bypassed any emotional sentiment and immediately invoked his forged authority over my 55% majority shareholder voting rights. His objective was completely destructive. He did not want to run my data intelligence firm. He wanted to sell my proprietary predictive algorithm directly to our largest market rival for $800 million. He had already negotiated a highly illegal back-channel deal that would grant him a massive liquid payout while entirely dismantling the company I had spent my entire adult life building from scratch. He demanded an immediate emergency vote to bypass the standard 90-day federal acquisition review period. He slammed the heavily forged legal documents onto the polished wood table, staring down the executives and daring anyone to challenge his absolute authority as my proxy. The board members were cornered. Corporate governance bylaws strictly mandated that a majority shareholder could force an emergency acquisition vote if they presented certified medical incapacitation documents from a licensed hospital. Julian had paid off the right people to make those exact documents look perfectly legitimate. He raised his right hand to initiate the final binding vote. He was exactly 10 seconds away from legally liquidating my entire legacy. Then the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Marcus walked into the room carrying his signature locked leather briefcase. He did not ask for permission to enter, and he did not introduce himself. He walked straight to the center of the mahogany table, completely ignoring Julian's outraged demands for corporate security to remove him. Marcus pulled a stack of heavily stamped legal documents from his briefcase and dropped them directly onto the polished wood. "I am the court-appointed CEO proxy for the Chief Executive Officer," Marcus announced, his deep voice cutting through the tense silence of the room. "And I am officially invoking Corporate Governance Bylaw Section 4, Paragraph 9. I am initiating a mandatory 48-hour compliance audit on the medical signatures presented by this man." Julian turned completely pale. "You cannot do that," he shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. "I hold the primary power of attorney. I am her husband. This is a private executive board vote." Marcus did not even look at him. He addressed the board members directly. "As a forensic auditor and legally recognized proxy, I have flagged the presented documents for suspected felony forgery. If any member of this board executes a binding vote while a federal compliance audit is active, you will be held personally and criminally liable for massive corporate fraud. The vote is legally stalled. Nobody signs anything for the next 48 hours. The room erupted into chaotic whispers, but the executives immediately pulled their gold pens away from the acquisition contracts. Nobody was willing to risk federal prison for a hasty buyout. Julian was completely paralyzed. He could not fight Marcus without inviting an immediate forensic investigation into the forged signatures. He was forced to pack up his leather folder and walk out of the boardroom, humiliated and entirely defeated. His massive $800 million payday was locked behind a solid legal wall. He rode the elevator down to the lobby in a state of blinding, furious panic. He had failed to secure the company. He had failed to get the board approval. The only thing keeping him out of federal prison now was my immediate death. He needed the toxicologist to find a corpse tomorrow morning. He needed Savannah to have finished the job with the lethal injection. Julian burst through the front door of my penthouse exactly 40 minutes later. He did not take off his jacket. He did not announce his return. He marched straight into the living room, his eyes wide and desperate, expecting to find a flatlining monitor and a cold, rigid body. Instead, he heard the steady, rhythmic beeping of my medical heart monitor. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the digital screen. Heart rate, exactly 72 beats per minute. Blood pressure perfectly stable at 120/80. Oxygen saturation at 99%. My chest rose and fell in a calm, relaxed rhythm. I was absolutely, undeniably alive. Savannah walked out of the kitchen holding her phone. She took one look at Julian's face and stopped. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Did you get the vote?" Julian ignored her entirely. He lunged toward my medical bed, grabbing the intravenous tubing. He traced the line down to my arm, looking for the injection site. He saw the empty syringe resting on the metal tray table. He grabbed it and shoved it into Savannah's face. "Did you push the dose?" He screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Did you inject the potassium chloride?" "I did it!" Savannah cried, taking a step back and holding her hands up defensively. "I pushed the entire 50 milligrams into the port, just like you told me to." I watched the liquid go into the tube. "I swear to God, Julian, I did it." "Then why is her heart still beating?" Julian roared, throwing the empty plastic syringe across the room where it shattered against the marble floor. "She should have gone into cardiac arrest 20 minutes ago. Why is she still breathing?" I lay perfectly still, keeping my eyes shut tight beneath the bright living room lights. The sterile saline flush was keeping my veins perfectly clear and my vitals strong, while the lethal potassium was soaking harmlessly into the thick foam mattress directly beneath my left hip. I deliberately slowed my breathing even further, projecting the absolute image of total biological peace, while the two of them descended into complete, inescapable madness. Savannah began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as she backed away from the bed. "I do not know, Julian," she sobbed loudly. "Maybe her tolerance is too high. Maybe the paralytic blocked the potassium. I do not know anything about medicine. I just pushed the plunger." Julian buried his face in his hands, pulling aggressively at his own hair. The perfectly curated facade of the stoic corporate leader had entirely collapsed. "We are dead," he whispered, his voice trembling with the absolute realization of his failure. "Marcus blocked the vote at the company. The board is auditing the signatures. If she does not die by tomorrow morning, the federal toxicologist is going to walk into this penthouse and arrest us for attempted murder. We have absolutely nothing." The tension in the room was suffocating. Their nerves were completely shattered. They were turning on each other, terrified of the invisible walls closing in around them. Julian thought he was fighting a dying woman and a stubborn auditor. He had absolutely no idea he was already trapped inside a federal cage that I had custom built for him. I let the steady beep of the heart monitor act as the final countdown to their absolute destruction. The digital clock on the medical monitor flipped to exactly 2 in the morning. The penthouse was completely silent, except for the rhythmic hiss of the artificial ventilator pushing sterile air into the room. I lay perfectly still, listening to the ambient sounds of my own home. From down the long corridor, I could hear the heavy, rhythmic snoring of my husband emanating from the primary suite. From the eastern guest wing, I could hear the faint sound of a television playing a late-night infomercial where Savannah had finally fallen asleep. They were both unconscious, dreaming of the empire they thought they had just stolen. They had no idea the architect of that empire was currently rebooting her central nervous system. I focused my attention on my right hand. I commanded my index finger to move. It curled inward, scraping against the Egyptian cotton sheet. There was no hesitation. There was no agonizing delay. The synthetic neurotoxin had entirely metabolized out of my bloodstream, neutralized by my hyper-accelerated metabolic rate and the constant flush of the sterile saline I had cleverly redirected. I was no longer a prisoner inside my own flesh. I took a deep, silent breath and pushed my palms flat against the mattress. I engaged my core muscles and slowly, deliberately pushed myself upward. I sat up. The physical sensation of vertical alignment after being entirely paralyzed was intoxicating, but I did not allow myself a single moment of emotional celebration. I swung my legs over the side of the rented hospital bed. My bare feet touched the cold, custom-imported marble floor. The sudden drop in temperature sent a sharp electric shock up my spine, confirming that every single nerve ending was fully operational. I stood up. My knees trembled for a fraction of a second, adjusting to the gravitational weight of my body, but my balance held firm. I was a ghost walking through my own graveyard. I did not need to turn on a single light. I knew the exact layout of this 6,000 square foot property because I had designed every single architectural detail myself. I moved with absolute silence, stepping only on the thick Persian runner rugs to muffle the sound of my footsteps. I walked past the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. The city lights of Chicago painted pale shadows across the walls. I bypassed the kitchen completely, ignoring the crystal glasses Julian and Savannah had left on the marble counter after their arrogant celebration. My destination was the southern wing of the penthouse, Julian's private study. It was a room he claimed as his ultimate masculine sanctuary. He kept the door locked with a highly sophisticated biometric keypad. He thought the heavy oak door and the digital security kept his secrets entirely safe from the world. He severely underestimated the woman who paid for the installation. When I hired the private security firm to outfit the penthouse 5 years ago, I mandated a hardwired master override code for every single internal door. It was a standard corporate contingency protocol. I stood before his locked study and typed the sequence into the glass keypad. 9472. The locking mechanism disengaged with a barely audible click. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, slipping into the room like a shadow and easing the door shut behind me. The room smelled of expensive leather and the lingering scent of his 25-year-old scotch. The moonlight filtered through the motorized blinds, illuminating his massive mahogany desk in the center of the room. I walked over and sat down in his custom ergonomic chair. Resting perfectly in the center of the desk was his primary personal laptop, a top-of-the-line machine he used to manage his pathetic mid-level real estate portfolio and apparently orchestrate the attempted murder of his wife. I opened the lid. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh white glow across my face. The login screen demanded a complex alphanumeric password. Julian was an incredibly predictable man. He operated on ego rather than actual intelligence. He believed he was a master strategist, but his security habits were fundamentally lazy. I did not need to guess his password. I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk pajamas and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. Marcus had slipped it into my hand during his 3-minute visit at the hospital. It was a military-grade bypass tool designed to aggressively circumvent commercial operating systems. I plugged the drive into the side port of the laptop. I watched as the screen flickered to black before overriding his lock screen entirely. The entire desktop materialized before my eyes. I had absolute unhindered access to his entire digital life. I checked the clock on the bottom right corner of the screen. It was 2:15 in the morning. I pulled a second drive from my pocket, a massive terabyte solid-state storage device. I plugged it into the secondary port and initiated a complete mirror clone of his entire hard drive. A progress bar appeared, estimating exactly 14 minutes to total completion. 14 minutes is an absolute eternity when you know exactly what you are looking for. I did not waste a single second opening his hidden photograph folders. I saw a folder explicitly named Savannah and ignored it completely. I had absolutely no interest in reading his pathetic romantic text messages or looking at whatever cheap lingerie he had purchased for his mistress. Love letters are for divorce courts and daytime television. I was preparing for a federal prosecution. I needed concrete, undeniable financial receipts. I opened his secure messaging applications. He used Telegram, believing the end-to-end encryption made him completely invisible. I exported the entire chat history. I found the specific conversation thread with an anonymous user designated only by a single alphabetical letter. It was his black market chemical supplier. I scrolled through the exact timestamps reading the cold calculated negotiations for the synthetic neuromuscular paralytic. I read the exact price he paid, $50,000 transferred via untraceable cryptocurrency. I copied the digital wallet addresses, the transaction hashes, and the delivery confirmation receipts. He had shipped the poison directly to a private post office box he rented under a fake corporate alias. I traced the blockchain ledger directly from his browser history, verifying the exact node transfers. He used a rudimentary tumbling service to hide the transaction, but he forgot to clear his application cache. Every single detail was meticulously logged and instantly transferred to my drive. I closed the messaging application and opened his personal accounting software. Julian claimed he was attending intensive real estate development conferences in Europe over the past 8 months. I pulled the master ledger for my secondary corporate credit card, the one I allowed him to use for legitimate business expenses. I cross-referenced the dates. I found the exact charges: $4,500 a night at the Four Seasons Hotel in Paris, $2,000 for private helicopter transfers in Monaco, $8,000 spent at a luxury boutique in Milan, $22,000 billed for a private yacht charter of the Amalfi Coast. I cross-referenced these dates against the corporate board meetings he claimed he was attending to secure international zoning permits. Every single trip was a complete fabrication. He was not attending real estate conferences. He was flying savannah around the world, funding his massive infidelity, using the exact wealth I generated from my data intelligence firm. Every single fraudulent charge was a documented breach of our corporate asset agreement. He was using federal corporate funds to finance his illicit personal lifestyle. It was another layer of tax fraud I could hand directly to the Internal Revenue Service. I downloaded every single folio, every invoice, and every forged expense report. I was building an airtight concrete cage of financial crimes. Every number told a story of a man digging his own grave with my money. I downloaded the forged signatures he had used to authorize the payments. I found a secondary billing ledger hidden in a subfolder. He had expensed a diamond necklace from a jeweler in Geneva, claiming it was a corporate gift for a retiring board member. The necklace cost $85,000. I pulled up Savannah's social media profile on his browser. There she was standing on a balcony in Switzerland, wearing the exact same $85,000 diamond necklace. He was not just stealing from me. He was leaving a digital trail so blatantly arrogant, it practically insulted my intelligence. I exported the photographs and attached them directly to the billing invoices. I found emails between Julian and a corporate shell creator in the Bahamas. He was paying exorbitant legal fees to hide the assets he was siphoning from my accounts. The retainer fee alone was $150,000 paid directly from my operating budget. I captured the wire confirmation numbers and the SWIFT codes. The puzzle was completely assembled. He had left behind a monumental mountain of federal evidence. I systematically archived all of it. The progress bar on the screen hit 99%. I watched the green line fill the remaining space. A silent notification confirmed the entire hard drive had been successfully cloned. It was exactly 2:29 in the morning. 14 minutes of absolute surgical precision. I safely ejected the solid-state drive and slipped it back into my pocket alongside the bypass tool. I closed the applications, clearing the recent activity logs to ensure absolutely no trace of my intrusion remained. I shut down the laptop, closing the lid and returning it to the exact millimeter position it occupied when I found it. I wiped the glass surface of the desk with my sleeve, ensuring I left no physical evidence of my presence. I stood up from the leather chair, pushing it back under the desk. I walked out of the study, letting the heavy oak door click securely shut behind me, the biometric lock automatically re-engaging. The penthouse remained entirely silent. I walked back down the long dark corridor, retracing my exact steps across the Persian rugs. I returned to the living room just as the first faint hints of dark blue began to color the eastern horizon over the lake. Sunrise was approaching. I climbed back into the rented medical bed, adjusting the Egyptian cotton sheets to cover my legs perfectly. I picked up the disconnected intravenous line from the mattress pad and carefully positioned the plastic port back near the crook of my left arm, maintaining the visual illusion of the lethal injection setup. I lay my head back onto the pillow. I completely relaxed my muscles, letting the heavy weight of the bed support my entire frame. I slowed my heart rate and regulated my breathing back to the shallow artificial rhythm of a woman clinging to her final hours. I closed my eyes as the morning light began to filter through the massive windows. I was no longer a victim waiting for the poison to take hold. I was a fully armed corporate executioner, possessing every single piece of data required to utterly destroy them both. They thought the sunrise would bring my death and their ultimate victory. They had absolutely no idea the ghost in the bed had already signed their federal death warrants. The morning sun climbed higher over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floor of my living room. Julian was pacing frantically near the kitchen island. He held his phone in a white knuckle grip, endlessly refreshing his corporate email, waiting for the board of directors to issue a formal statement regarding the compliance audit. Savannah was sitting on the custom velvet armchair, filing her nails with absolute detached arrogance. She believed she had already committed the perfect murder and was simply waiting for my biological clock to run out. The tension between them was a highly volatile chemical reaction, just begging for a single spark to ignite an absolute explosion. I was more than happy to provide that spark. During the chaotic 3 minutes Marcus spent in the hospital intensive care unit, he did not just establish a communication protocol. He also taped a matte black untraceable burner phone directly beneath the plastic railing of my medical bed. It was a preemptive tactical strike. He knew Julian would eventually isolate me, and I would need an invisible lifeline. I kept my eyes completely shut and slipped my right hand under the thick cotton blanket, tracing the metal frame until my fingers brushed against the smooth plastic of the device. I pulled it slowly toward my chest, hiding it completely beneath the sheets. The screen was set to maximum dimness. I operated it entirely by touch and memory. Savannah was a creature driven entirely by bottomless greed. I knew this the day I hired her, and I knew she would not be able to resist taking a massive cut of the stolen money for herself. When she executed the $2.5 million wire transfer through my shadow network, she had quietly skimmed $400,000, routing it to a secondary account, hidden under her maiden name. It was a classic amateur embezzlement move, but $400,000 was not enough to shatter Julian's massive ego. I needed him to believe she was taking absolutely everything. Marcus and I had anticipated her betrayal and weaponized it. Through the shadow network, Marcus had rewritten the graphic user interface of the banking portal. When Julian logged in to verify the funds, he would not see the actual balances. He would see a meticulously crafted digital illusion. He would see a ledger showing that Savannah had not only skimmed the secondary funds, but had actively initiated a sweeping protocol to drain the entire $15 million Delaware shell account into an untraceable Cayman Island trust entirely controlled by her. I unlocked the burner phone and opened the encrypted messaging application. I routed the message through a proxy server in Singapore to ensure the origin ping could never be traced back to the Penthouse wireless network. I typed out a single calculated sentence. Your nurse is redirecting the Delaware funds to a Cayman account. Check the routing. I did not add any threats. I did not explain who I was. The absolute anonymity made the warning infinitely more terrifying. I hit send, targeting Julian's primary cell phone number. I slipped the burner device back beneath the mattress pad and returned my hands to my sides, adopting the rigid, lifeless posture of a coma patient. Exactly 10 seconds later, the sharp, distinct chime of a text message echoed through the silent penthouse. Julian stopped pacing. He looked down at the glowing screen of his phone. I watched his face through the narrow slit of my eyelids. The color drained entirely from his cheeks, replacing the flush of his manic anger with the absolute pale white of pure terror. He stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic information. He looked up slowly, locking his eyes onto Savannah. She was humming a quiet tune, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine suspended directly above her head. Julian did not say a single word to her. He shoved the phone into his pocket and practically sprinted down the hallway toward his private locked study. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him. Inside that room, I knew exactly what was happening. Julian was violently typing his credentials into his laptop, desperately trying to access the Delaware Shell Company portal to verify the anonymous tip. When the dashboard loaded, his heart would essentially stop. The fake ledger Marcus had installed was an absolute masterpiece of psychological warfare. It displayed a massive red pending transaction, $17.1 million being aggressively routed out of his control and into a hostile offshore entity. The digital footprint was deliberately stamped with Savannah's unique user authentication token. It even showed a fabricated chat log with a Cayman banking official authorizing the final clearance code. The evidence was completely undeniable and totally fabricated to inflict maximum emotional destruction. Julian had spent the last 8 months believing he was the undisputed mastermind of a massive corporate heist. He thought he was using Savannah as a highly disposable pawn to execute the messy physical details of my murder and handle the banking logistics. He assumed she was entirely compliant and completely devoted to him. Seeing that fabricated ledger shattered his arrogant reality into a million jagged pieces. He was not the apex predator. He was the mark. His mistress was stealing his entire fortune right out from under him while he was busy fighting my brother-in-law for control of the corporate board. The brilliance of the trap was its absolute perfect timing. Julian was already pushed to the absolute psychological brink by the failed boardroom coup and my stubborn refusal to die. His central nervous system was flooded with adrenaline and sheer panic. He did not have the cognitive bandwidth to analyze the banking portal for digital inconsistencies. He did not have the time to call a forensic accountant to verify the routing numbers. He saw the missing money, and his brain instantly snapped to the most logical, agonizing conclusion. He had been played. I heard the heavy oak door of the study violently rip open. Julian's heavy footsteps stormed down the hallway, hitting the imported hardwood floors like a succession of rapid gunshots. He was breathing heavily, his lungs gasping for air as he marched back into the living room. Savannah finally looked up from her nails, a confused expression crossing her face as she registered the absolute homicidal fury radiating from his eyes. The seed of absolute discord had been successfully planted. The alliance between the husband and the mistress was completely fractured. They had united to destroy me, but greed is a highly corrosive acid, and I had just poured a gallon of it directly onto their partnership. Julian stormed out of his private study with the heavy footfalls of a man walking to the executioner's block. He did not stop in the living room. He walked directly up to Savannah, grabbed her roughly by the fabric of her white medical scrubs, and dragged her physically down the long corridor toward my primary bedroom. I had been relocated to the primary bedroom late last night when Julian decided the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room exposed his morbid hospital setup to the neighboring high-rise buildings. My automated medical bed now sat directly in the center of my massive sleeping quarters, positioned right next to my custom floating nightstand. Julian shoved Savannah into the room with such violent force that she stumbled and crashed into the edge of my mattress. I lay perfectly still, maintaining the exact shallow breathing of a coma patient as the absolute climax of their betrayal exploded inches from my face. "What the hell is wrong with you, Julian?" Savannah screamed, regaining her balance and backing away toward the heavy oak dresser. She rubbed her arm where his fingers had dug deeply into her skin. Julian did not answer immediately. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He thrust the glowing device directly into her face. "Look at it!" he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the bedroom. "Look at the $17 million transfer pending for a Cayman Island trust account registered entirely under your name. You thought you could bleed me dry while I was busy fighting the corporate board. You thought I was just some stupid collateral damage in your little embezzlement scheme." Savannah stared at the screen, her eyes going wide with absolute genuine confusion. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice cracking. "I did not authorize any transfer to the Cayman Islands. I only took $400,000 from the shadow account. I swear to God, Julian, I just wanted a small safety net in case the succession plan fell apart. I do not even have a Cayman Island trust." Julian let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that sounded like tearing metal. A safety net, he mocked, stepping closer and completely invading her physical space. "You call $17.1 million a safety net. You drained the entire Delaware shell company. You took the $15 million we wired from the hospital, and you took the $2.5 million we pulled this morning. You hijacked the entire network routing protocol using your own authentication tokens. The digital ledger has your explicit signature all over it, Savannah. Do not stand there in my penthouse and lie to my face after I gave you the keys to the absolute kingdom. I am not lying, Savannah shrieked, backing up until her shoulders hit the wall. I do not know how to bypass a corporate federal banking firewall. You're the one who set up the shell companies, Julian. Maybe Marcus found the accounts. Maybe Victoria had an automated failsafe built into the system. You're projecting your own failures onto me because you walked into that boardroom and got completely publicly humiliated by an auditor. The mention of his boardroom failure was the exact psychological trigger I knew would completely break his fragile ego. Julian lost whatever tiny fraction of rational control he had left. He slammed his fist onto the top of my dresser, rattling my expensive perfume bottles. I did not fail, he screamed, his face turning a dark, violent shade of red. I orchestrated the most complex logistical assassination in corporate history. I bought the synthetic neuromuscular paralytic from a black market supplier in Eastern Europe. I paid $50,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to secure a military-grade neurotoxin that would perfectly mimic a massive brainstem stroke. I spent 6 months planning the exact dosage, tracking her travel schedule, and waiting for the perfect moment to spike her morning coffee. I did all the heavy lifting to eliminate the only obstacle standing between us and an $800 million buyout. He was pacing aggressively around my medical bed, waving his arms in pure manic desperation. I watched him through the microscopic slit of my eyelashes. He was practically testifying in a federal courtroom right now. You did the heavy lifting, Savannah spat back, her own anger finally superseding her fear. She pushed herself off the wall and marched right up to him. You poured a vial of liquid into a coffee cup, Julian. That is all you did. I am the one who spent the last 3 weeks meticulously forging her signature on the medical proxy documents. I am the one who falsified the offshore trust transfer authorizations. I sat at my desk for 40 hours, perfectly replicating her handwriting, so you could walk into that boardroom holding legally binding documents. I am the one who injected 50 milligrams of potassium chloride into her intravenous line this morning because your stupid imported poison was too slow to finish the job. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation walks into this room, I am the one holding the actual murder weapon. You incompetent parasite, Julian hissed, leaning down until he was practically spitting in her face. You could not even do that right. You pushed the plunger 3 hours ago and she is still breathing. Her heart rate is perfectly stable. You probably missed the vein entirely because you're nothing but a greedy amateur who got lucky I needed an assistant. I am the only reason you even know how to access her secondary holding accounts. Savannah fired back, completely abandoning any pretense of respect. You are a mid-level real estate broker who married a billionaire. You do not understand data architecture. You do not understand biometric firewalls. I executed the digital wire frauds. I authenticated the $15 million transfer using her retinal scan while you just stood there holding the phone. I committed Class A federal wire fraud for you, Julian. I risked a 20-year minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary because you promised we were buying a $10 million penthouse in Manhattan. And now you are accusing me of stealing money that I do not even have. They were entirely unhinged, standing over my paralyzed body and shouting their exact criminal offenses into the open air. Julian detailed the exact origin of the poison, the price he paid, and the premeditated timeline of the attempted murder. Savannah freely admitted to multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, federal forgery, illegal wire fraud, and the direct administration of a lethal chemical agent. They corroborated each other's statements, cross-referencing their individual crimes in a desperate attempt to prove who carried the heavier burden of guilt. It was a vicious, beautiful symphony of absolute self-destruction. Julian grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "Cancel the Cayman transfer right now," he commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, gravelly whisper. "Pull out your laptop log into the offshore portal and reverse the routing. If you do not put that $17 million back into the Delaware account by noon, I am going to call the Chicago police and tell them my deranged private nurse just confessed to poisoning my wife with potassium chloride. I will hand them the empty syringe myself." Savannah laughed right in his face, a cold, hollow sound, devoid of any humor. "Go ahead, Julian," she challenged, her eyes blazing with pure hatred. "Call the police. And when they arrest me, I will hand them the encrypted telegram logs showing you buying the paralytic. I will tell them exactly which Eastern European server you used. I will show them the $4,500 a night hotel receipts from Paris and Milan that you illegally billed to her corporate credit card. We are perfectly mutually assured destruction, Julian. If I go down to a federal prison, you are coming right down with me in the exact same transport van. I lay silently beneath the Egyptian cotton sheets, letting the sheer magnitude of their stupidity wash over me. They were standing exactly 2 feet away from the custom floating nightstand. Resting perfectly centered on that nightstand was my customized Apple Watch. It was not a standard retail model. As the chief executive officer of a data intelligence firm dealing with classified government analytics, my personal hardware was heavily modified by my top engineers. The microphone array possessed studio-level acoustic sensitivity designed to capture boardroom whispers from 40 feet away. It was currently actively recording. The moment Julian had dragged Savannah into the bedroom and begun shouting, I had used the absolute smallest twitch of my right index finger to tap the raised digital crown of the watch, resting just inches from my hand. The device was programmed with an emergency biometric macro. One tap activated an 18-minute continuous high-definition audio recording. But the brilliant part was not the recording itself. The brilliance was the data routing. The watch did not store the audio file locally where Julian could potentially find and delete it. The device was hardwired through a cellular mesh network directly to an encrypted cloud server controlled entirely by Marcus. Every single syllable of their vicious argument, every exact dollar amount, every explicit confession of forgery, wire fraud, and attempted murder was being recorded in pristine 4,000 kilobits per second audio and instantly transmitted to a senior forensic auditor standing by in a downtown office. They spent exactly 18 minutes screaming at each other, detailing the absolute complete timeline of their conspiracy. Julian confessed to the premeditated poisoning. Savannah confessed to the financial forgery and the lethal injection attempt. They outlined the exact mechanisms of their crimes, fighting over who was more legally liable, while completely failing to realize they were building their own ironclad federal indictment. The argument finally hit an exhausted stalemate. Julian let go of her shoulders, stepping back and running his hands over his face in pure defeat. "Just get your laptop," he muttered, his voice completely drained of its manic energy. "Bring the laptop into the bedroom. We are going to sit here and trace the routing numbers line by line until we find out exactly where that money went. Nobody leaves this penthouse until the funds are secured." Savannah did not argue. She shot him a look of absolute pure venom, smoothed down her wrinkled white scrubs, and walked out of the bedroom toward the living room to retrieve her machine. Julian collapsed into the heavy leather reading chair in the corner of the room, burying his face in his hands. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing perfectly shallow, and my face entirely relaxed. The 18-minute timer on my watch silently hit 0. A microscopic haptic vibration pulsed against the wood of the nightstand, confirming the total audio file had been successfully compiled and fully synced to the remote server. The trap was absolutely perfectly executed. Marcus now possessed the cloned hard drive data, the fraudulent wire transfer logs from the federal honeypot, and a pristine 18-minute audio confession covering every single felony they had committed over the past 8 months. Julian thought he was locked in a bitter standoff with his mistress over missing funds. He had absolutely no idea the war was already entirely over and he had lost everything. Julian finally dragged himself out of the heavy leather reading chair and stumbled out of the primary bedroom. Savannah had already retreated to the eastern guest wing to furiously search her laptop for the missing $17 million. The penthouse fell back into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the steady, artificial hiss of my medical ventilator. I waited exactly 10 minutes, ensuring they were completely absorbed in their own manufactured digital panic, before I allowed myself to move. I slipped my right hand beneath the thick mattress pad and retrieved the matte black burner phone Marcus had hidden under the plastic bed frame. I opened the encrypted messaging application to confirm the status of the massive audio transfer. A single green checkmark glowed against the dark screen. Marcus had received the entire 18-minute felony confession in pristine high-definition quality. I typed a brief, highly specific message using the silent digital keyboard. Audio confirmed. Initiate the final legal phase. Lock every single exit. Marcus replied instantly. His response was devoid of any emotion, delivering only the cold, hard facts of their impending destruction. The federal indictments are being drafted right now. The Securities and Exchange Commission has formally accepted the wire fraud logs generated by the Shadow Network. The Department of Justice is finalizing the arrest warrants based on the toxicological evidence from the cloned hard drive and the recorded confession. It is over, Victoria. It was not just over. It was an absolute legal annihilation. Marcus was a senior forensic auditor with direct high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not simply hand our gathered evidence over to a local Chicago police precinct. He bypassed the city jurisdiction entirely and marched straight to the federal prosecutor. He presented them with the cloned terabyte drive containing the black market cryptocurrency receipts, the forged medical proxy documents, and the undeniable digital logs of Class A wire fraud, executed through a federally monitored honeypot. The 18-minute audio recording of Savannah and Julian explicitly detailing their conspiracy to commit murder was the final crushing weight of their absolute destruction. The Assistant United States Attorney did not hesitate for a single second. They immediately initiated a sealed grand jury indictment against both of them. Warrants were drawn up for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit major wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and massive corporate embezzlement. The legal trap was completely permanently set. There would be no bail hearings. 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 There would be no reduced plea deals for Julian. He was going straight into a federal holding facility the moment the steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. But I was not going to let the federal government execute all the justice on my behalf. I needed to ensure that when Julian walked into his arrogant memorial gala tomorrow night, he did so as an absolutely broke, desperate man. I accessed my private master banking portal through the secure browser on the burner phone. Julian firmly believed he was still operating on my limitless corporate credit line. He had used my primary black card to book the massive downtown ballroom for the memorial event to buy Savannah her $10,000 designer morning gown, and to secure the massive deposit on the private jet to Zurich. He thought they were boarding on Saturday morning. I initiated a total and complete financial lockdown protocol. I permanently cancelled the primary platinum card. I entirely revoked his authorized user access to the secondary corporate expense accounts. I froze the joint checking account holding the pathetic minor remnants of his real estate commissions. I flagged every single credit card attached to his social security number for suspected massive fraudulent activity. Within 60 seconds, Julian went from a man wielding the arrogant illusion of a $50 million empire to a man whose debit card would be aggressively declined at a local coffee shop. The absolute financial guillotine dropped silently in the digital background, leaving him entirely penniless without triggering a single notification on his personal phone. He would only find out when his cards began to painfully, violently bounce. There was only one final parameter left to strictly control before I was ready to execute my ultimate return: the physical exits. Julian had planned a massive public memorial gala at the downtown Sterling Ballroom for tomorrow evening. He fully intended to announce his official takeover as interim chief executive officer while simultaneously mourning my tragic, untimely death in front of my entire corporate board. I needed to ensure he could absolutely never return to this luxury penthouse after that event concluded. I opened the property management application for my Gold Coast residential building. Because I owned the penthouse outright, I held the absolute master administrative rights for the entire top-floor security grid. I located Julian's biometric profile and his electronic key fob access codes in the system registry. I did not delete them immediately because that would trigger an immediate security alert to his phone. Instead, I scheduled an automated silent revocation protocol timed precisely for 8 o'clock tomorrow night. The exact moment he stepped up to the podium in that ballroom to deliver my fake eulogy. His fingerprints would be entirely erased from the residential security system. The private elevator would completely stop recognizing his commands. The underground parking garage gates would stay permanently locked. The massive oak front door would refuse his entry. He would be completely, entirely locked out of the incredibly luxurious life he thought he had successfully stolen. I locked the burner phone and safely hid it back beneath the mattress pad. I rested my head perfectly against the soft hospital pillow and closed my eyes, letting a genuine calm wash over my entire body. Every single variable was controlled. Every single piece of evidence was secured in a federal vault. Every financial asset was locked tightly away. Tomorrow night, I was going to walk into my memorial gala and burn his world to the ground. The sun set over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported marble floors of my empty penthouse. Julian and Savannah had left for the downtown ballroom exactly 2 hours ago. They walked out the heavy oak front door dressed in absolute luxury, completely convinced they were leaving a dying, paralyzed woman behind. The moment the biometric lock engaged and secured the perimeter, I pushed the thick Egyptian cotton blankets off my legs and stood up. There was no hesitation in my muscles. The synthetic neurotoxin was completely flushed from my system, neutralized by the continuous sterile saline drip I had cleverly redirected earlier that morning. I walked directly into my massive walk-in closet and bypassed the rows of soft designer evening gowns. Tonight was not about mourning or playing the tragic victim. Tonight was about absolute corporate execution. I pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit I had commissioned in London. The sharp, aggressive lines and structured shoulders projected absolute, unquestionable dominance. I dressed in total silence, buttoning the crisp white silk shirt and securing a heavy platinum watch to my left wrist. I walked out to the private elevator. Marcus was waiting for me in the underground parking garage, sitting behind the wheel of a black armored sport utility vehicle. He did not ask how I was feeling or offer any empty emotional platitudes. He simply handed me a thick leather folder containing the sealed federal indictments and put the massive vehicle into drive. The ride to the financial district was completely silent. We were two apex predators heading to a hunting ground Julian had generously rented using my own stolen corporate funds. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but my mind remained violently sharp, calculating the absolute total destruction ahead. The Sterling Ballroom was the most exclusive and aggressively expensive venue in the entire city of Chicago. Julian had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate his own impending wealth. As Marcus and I slipped quietly through the heavily guarded service entrance, I accessed the venue security cameras through my encrypted tablet. I watched the live high-definition feed of the main floor. It was a spectacular masterpiece of absolute fraudulent decadence. Julian had billed exactly $150,000 to my corporate black card just for the custom floral arrangements. Massive cascading walls of white orchids and rare imported lilies choked the massive room, projecting a sickening aura of artificial grief. A 12-piece string quartet played somber classical music in the far corner, costing another $20,000. The catering was billed at exactly $500 per plate, featuring white truffle risotto and butter-poached lobster. He was aggressively feeding my corporate board of directors, using the exact money he stole directly from my operating budget. And standing right next to him, greeting the arriving VIP guests, was Savannah. She was not wearing her cheap white medical scrubs tonight. She was wearing a floor-length custom black silk gown. I recognized the obscure designer instantly. It was a $10,000 dress from a highly exclusive boutique in Milan purchased just yesterday. She had accessorized it with the exact $85,000 diamond necklace Julian had illegally expensed as a corporate retirement gift. She looked absolutely radiant, playing the exact role of the grieving but endlessly supportive junior executive to absolute perfection. They were hosting a massive glamorous party celebrating my murder, and they were doing it right in front of the entire Chicago financial district, using my own money to proudly fund the spectacle. I stood in the darkened audiovisual control room located directly above the main ballroom floor. Through the massive one-way glass window, I had a perfect tactical view of the entire massive event. Marcus stood silently beside me, his strong arms crossed tightly over his chest, monitoring the federal task force staging securely in the marble lobby downstairs. I watched Julian work the crowded room. He was a masterclass in pure sociopathic manipulation. He held a crystal glass of sparkling water, adopting the rigid posture of a man entirely too devastated to consume alcohol. He walked slowly from table to table, shaking hands with the 12 senior executives of my massive data intelligence firm. He firmly clasped their shoulders, whispering somber, calculated updates about my rapidly deteriorating medical condition. He was precisely laying the absolute final groundwork for his aggressive corporate coup. I carefully watched him approach the wealthy chairman of my board, a brilliant man I had personally recruited from a massive rival tech giant. Julian dramatically lowered his head, wiping an entirely fabricated tear from his right eye. He was lying to them, claiming that the top-tier doctors had finally given up all reasonable medical hope. He was intensely telling them that I was slowly entering my final painful hours of private home hospice care, and my damaged heart was rapidly failing. He was ruthlessly manipulating their basic human empathy to deliberately bypass the 48-hour compliance audit Marcus had aggressively enforced. If he could totally convince the executive board that my imminent death was an absolute biological certainty, he could rapidly push the massive emergency acquisition vote directly through before the federal toxicologist ever arrived at my penthouse. He was incredibly arrogant, but he was also terrifyingly efficient at selling an absolute massive destructive lie. Savannah finally detached herself from Julian's side and began mingling directly with the wealthy junior vice presidents. I amplified the highly sensitive directional audio feed from the security cameras to actively listen to her arrogant conversations. She was deliberately speaking in a hushed, respectful tone, but her rapid words were laced with absolute toxic ambition. She was already aggressively positioning herself as Julian's indispensable right-hand woman, heavily implying that once the succession protocol was officially triggered, she would be permanently stepping into a senior executive role. She was blatantly wearing my illegally stolen money directly on her physical body and confidently spending my hard-earned corporate equity with her arrogant mouth. The sheer audacity of her endless greed was absolutely staggering to witness. She happily clinked her crystal champagne flute with the chief financial officer, a naive man who had spent the last 5 years blindly trusting my professional judgment. She smiled warmly at him, the $85,000 diamonds sparkling brightly under the massive crystal chandeliers. She firmly believed she had brilliantly outsmarted a powerful woman who built complex predictive algorithms for the Federal Defense Department. She arrogantly thought her forged medical signatures and her stolen Delaware Shell Company funds made her entirely untouchable tonight. I quietly watched her sip her expensive vintage champagne, entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that the $17 million digital banking illusion Marcus had brilliantly created was still violently tearing her fragile partnership with Julian apart from the inside. They were desperately putting on a completely united corporate front for the wealthy public, but I vividly knew the absolute paranoid terror fiercely burning right beneath their highly polished, expensive surfaces. I checked the heavy platinum watch securely fastened on my left wrist. It was exactly 8:00 on the dot. The string quartet gracefully faded their elegant classical music to complete total silence. The massive crystal chandeliers positioned directly above the ballroom floor immediately dimmed, casting a single soft dramatic spotlight entirely onto the large center stage. A massive digital projector vividly illuminated the thick white screen securely anchored behind the mahogany podium, displaying a massive high-definition photograph of my face. The bold black text written directly below the image falsely read, "Victoria, a legendary legacy of brilliant innovation." It was so incredibly clinical and emotionally hollow. Julian walked slowly up the carpeted stairs to the stage. Savannah took a prominent seat at the VIP front table specifically reserved for grieving family members and senior executives. She arrogantly crossed her legs, meticulously adjusting the $10,000 silk gown, and smiled softly to herself. She arrogantly thought she had officially won. Julian confidently stepped right up to the mahogany podium and firmly adjusted the microphone. The massive crowded room of 300 wealthy guests instantly fell into absolute dead silence. You could literally hear the faint metallic clinking of expensive silverware quietly settling against fine china plates. Julian aggressively gripped the outer edges of the heavy wooden podium, taking a deep, dramatic, shuddering breath to perfectly simulate a broken man struggling to hold his emotional composure. He slowly looked out over the massive sea of my loyal employees, my wealthy investors, and my corporate partners. He was arrogantly standing on a massive mountain of my money, wearing a custom expensive Italian suit paid for by my predictive algorithms, confidently preparing to publicly steal my entire life work. He slowly cleared his throat and leaned deeply into the microphone. I firmly pressed my right hand against the cold, solid, bulletproof glass of the secure observation window. The time was now. Julian gripped the edges of the mahogany podium and leaned intimately into the microphone. His voice echoed through the massive sterling ballroom, carrying a perfectly manufactured tone of profound, absolute grief. He looked down at the VIP table where my board of directors sat and delivered a masterclass in sociopathic theater. He told them about my supposedly deteriorating condition. He painted a tragic, vivid picture of a brilliant woman slowly fading away in a hospital bed entirely dependent on artificial life support. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing a single calculated tear to roll down his right cheek. It was a spectacular performance designed specifically to manipulate the financial markets and secure emergency executive voting rights over my 55% majority shares. He did not care about my legacy. He cared about the $800 million hostile buyout he had illegally negotiated with our largest competitor. He raised his chin, projecting the false strength of a surviving widower ready to shoulder the massive burden of my data intelligence firm. He took a deep, shuddering breath and delivered his final, highly rehearsed line. "Victoria built an empire, but her body has failed her. She is no longer capable of guiding this ship. Victoria would have wanted me to lead us into the future." He paused, expecting the somber, respectful applause of the wealthy crowd. He did not get applause. He got absolute total silence. From the secure audiovisual control room, located directly above the ballroom, I gave Marcus the final signal. Marcus tapped a single command on his encrypted tablet. The microphone feed at the podium instantly died, emitting a sharp electronic whine before cutting to complete dead air. Julian tapped the metal grill of the microphone, looking confused. He motioned toward the sound technicians sitting in the back of the room, but they were already completely locked out of their own system. Marcus had hijacked the entire digital infrastructure of the ballroom using the master override protocols I designed. the massive high-definition projector screen behind Julian violently flickered. The giant fake mourning photograph of my face abruptly vanished, replaced by a stark, blinding white screen. The secondary lighting array shifted aggressively, snapping the warm ambient dining lights to a harsh, brilliant white that illuminated every single corner of the massive room. The sudden shift in atmosphere immediately shattered the manufactured somber mood. 300 wealthy guests began murmuring in absolute confusion, looking around for an explanation. Julian gripped the podium tighter, his artificial confidence faltering as he realized he had completely lost control of the massive production. Then the massive 10-foot-tall solid oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently swung open. The heavy brass hinges groaned loudly, cutting right through the nervous whispers of the crowd. Every single head in the room instantly turned toward the back of the hall. I did not roll in using a hospital wheelchair. I did not look like a frail, dying woman clinging to her final hours of palliative care. I walked directly into the blinding light wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit. The structured shoulders and pristine white silk shirt projected absolute unquestionable executive dominance. My posture was perfectly straight. My stride was predatory and completely effortless. The synthetic paralytic was entirely gone, and I was operating at maximum biological and cognitive capacity. I was not alone. I was flanked on my right by Marcus holding his signature-locked leather briefcase containing the cloned terabyte hard drive and the 18-minute audio confession. Flanking my left were 3 senior litigation partners from the most ruthless corporate law firm in Chicago. We moved together as a highly synchronized lethal unit, completely dominating the physical space of the massive ballroom. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and absolutely chaotic. A wealthy venture capitalist sitting near the entrance physically jumped out of his chair, knocking his crystal water glass onto the floor where it shattered loudly. The chairman of my board of directors dropped his expensive linen napkin and openly gasped, staring at me as if he had just seen a literal ghost rising from the grave. He had just spent the last hour listening to Julian claim my brain activity was completely gone. Now he was watching me march into the room with the lethal precision of a military commander. The murmur of the crowd rapidly escalated into a deafening wave of shocked, frantic whispers. I completely ignored them. I did not smile. I did not wave. I kept my eyes entirely locked onto the mahogany podium, standing at the far end of the room. I walked straight down the center aisle, the crowd naturally parting for me like the Red Sea. I felt the absolute raw power of the moment vibrating through my leather soles with every single step. I approached the VIP table located directly in front of the stage. Savannah was sitting there frozen in absolute pure terror. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of dirty chalk. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Her hand trembled so violently that her crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the marble floor, splashing expensive vintage wine across the hem of her $10,000 designer silk gown. The $85,000 diamond necklace resting against her collarbone suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating chain. She looked at me, and then she looked at Julian, realizing in real time that her entire fraudulent reality was actively collapsing. The $17 million digital banking illusion was no longer her biggest problem. The woman she had personally injected with 50 milligrams of potassium chloride this morning was currently standing right in front of her, alive and completely dangerous. She shrank back into her chair, desperately trying to make herself invisible, but there was absolutely nowhere to hide. I did not even break my stride to acknowledge her pathetic existence. Her ultimate punishment was already sealed inside the federal indictments Marcus carried in his briefcase. Julian was completely paralyzed. He stood behind the podium, gripping the wood so hard his knuckles were entirely white. His eyes were perfectly wide, mirroring the absolute catastrophic destruction of his entire reality. He watched me climb the 5 carpeted stairs to the main stage with a steady, deliberate pace. I did not rush. I let him suffer through every single second of my ascent. He had spent the last 24 hours believing he had successfully murdered me. He had stood in my living room celebrating my death and draining my bank accounts. Now the woman he tried to kill was standing less than 2 feet away from him, breathing perfectly, wearing a suit that cost more than his entire miserable real estate portfolio. I stepped right up to the podium. Julian was physically hyperventilating. He backed away from the microphone, his chest heaving, his perfectly styled hair suddenly looking completely disheveled. He tried to speak, but his throat was entirely dry. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He was a pathetic, broken man, staring directly into the eyes of his own executioner. The arrogant facade of the grieving future chief executive officer melted away, leaving nothing but a terrified coward who had just realized he walked directly into a massive federal trap. Marcus stepped up right behind me and plugged a small encrypted bypass drive directly into the podium console, overriding the system lockout. The digital microphone instantly reactivated with a sharp, crisp hum. The entire room fell completely silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. 300 people were holding their collective breath, staring at the stage in absolute shock. The board members, who were moments away from signing over their equity, were now rigidly sitting in their chairs, realizing they had almost been completely scammed out of $800 million. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the polished mahogany. I did not address the massive crowd of terrified executives and confused investors. I did not offer any emotional explanations about my miraculous recovery. I looked directly into Julian's panicking eyes, ensuring my voice carried through the massive speakers with absolute cold mechanical precision. Every single syllable was designed to permanently shatter his massive unchecked ego. Julian, you always were terrible at math. The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, striking him like physical blows. He flinched, taking another step backward until his shoulders hit the bright white projector screen. The crowd remained entirely silent, completely captivated by the brutal public execution happening right in front of them. The succession clause requires my death. I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the absolute devastation of my statement. I watched his eyes dart toward the exit doors, calculating his escape routes, but my legal team was already blocking the stairs. Marcus stood like a stone wall, holding the absolute legal authority to ruin his life. There was absolutely no way out. He was completely cornered in front of the most powerful people in the city of Chicago. The massive web of forged documents and stolen funds he had built was completely instantly useless. And as you can see, I am feeling incredibly well today. I looked him up and down, registering his expensive Italian suit and the platinum Rolex ticking uselessly on his wrist. I thought about the forged medical proxy, the stolen $15 million, the black market poison, and the endless, audacious lies he had just spoken into this very microphone. I did not feel any sorrow for the end of our 8-year marriage. I felt nothing but absolute pristine clarity. I had survived his cowardly assassination attempt, and I had meticulously built a concrete cage of federal evidence that would keep him locked away for the rest of his natural life. I stared directly into his soul, watching the absolute final spark of his arrogant ambition completely die. I leaned closer to the microphone and delivered the final lethal blow. Though I cannot say the same for your portfolio. Julian stared at me for exactly 5 seconds before his basic survival instincts finally kicked in. He was a cornered animal, desperately trying to chew his own leg off to escape a massive steel trap. He forced a highly exaggerated, hysterical smile onto his pale face and lunged right back toward the mahogany podium. He actually tried to wrap his arms around my shoulders to pull me into a tight emotional embrace for the hundreds of wealthy onlookers. He was aggressively attempting to play the role of the overwhelmed, grateful husband, witnessing a literal biological miracle. He reached out his trembling hands, shouting to the silent room that his constant prayers had finally been answered. He loudly claimed the cutting-edge medical treatments he had personally authorized had finally broken the catastrophic coma. He passionately told the board of directors that their beloved chief executive officer had miraculously returned to them just in time. It was a completely pathetic, nauseating display of absolute desperate improvisation. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or pull away. I simply raised my right hand and placed it flat against his chest, stopping his forward momentum completely. Do not touch me, Julian, I said, my voice carrying through the massive ballroom speakers with the cold, heavy impact of a solid steel hammer. There was absolutely no miracle here tonight. The only medical event that occurred was that your untraceable black market neurotoxin finally metabolized completely out of my bloodstream. The hysterical artificial smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated terror. A collective, massive gasp echoed through the ballroom as the 12 senior members of my executive board registered the terrifying word neurotoxin. The wealthy investors who had been weeping into their expensive linen napkins just 5 minutes ago were now staring at Julian as if he were a loaded, highly unstable weapon. I turned my attention away from my paralyzed husband and looked directly at Marcus standing stoically to my right. Execute the digital payload, I commanded. Marcus did not hesitate for a single millisecond. He tapped the glowing screen of his encrypted tactical tablet. The massive high-definition projector anchored behind us violently flashed. The blinding white light was instantly replaced by towering, highly magnified images of heavily encrypted banking ledgers. The financial documents were 50 feet tall, completely dominating the entire visual space of the ballroom. I did not need to scream or cry to prove my case to the public. I let the raw, unassailable financial data do all the aggressive talking. Look closely at the main screen, gentlemen, I announced calmly, addressing my absolutely silent board of directors. You are currently looking at the primary digital ledger for a Delaware shell company that Julian secretly incorporated exactly 4 months ago. He did not call this emergency memorial gala tonight to secure the future of our data intelligence firm. He called this meeting because his original exit strategy encountered a massive biological scheduling error. He desperately needed me dead by tomorrow morning to permanently bypass the 48-hour compliance audit on his heavily forged medical proxy documents. Julian stumbled backward, shaking his head frantically. Do not listen to her, he pleaded, his voice cracking pathetically over the microphone. She is suffering from severe neurological trauma. The stroke entirely damaged her cognitive functions. None of these documents are real. I completely ignored his pathetic whimpering and pointed directly at the massive projected red timestamps. At exactly 7:45 yesterday morning, while I was completely trapped inside my own paralyzed body suffering from locked-in syndrome, Julian and his junior mistress stood right over my hospital bed. They physically forced my paralyzed eyelids open to bypass the retinal scanner on my private encrypted ledger phone. They forcefully pressed my limp thumb against the glass to satisfy the highly complex thermal biometric lock. They immediately initiated a massive illegal wire transfer directly into that untraceable Delaware shell account. You can clearly see the exact transaction hash currently displayed on the screen. Exactly $15 million in liquid capital stolen directly from our secure corporate reserve funds. The chief financial officer of my company aggressively stood up from the VIP table, his face purple with absolute sheer rage. He looked closely at the projected routing numbers and then turned his head to look directly at Savannah. She was physically shrinking deep into her padded chair, covering her pale face with her violently trembling hands. The entire room of elite corporate executives was actively witnessing the absolute undeniable proof of a massive internal financial heist. But $15 million was simply not enough to satisfy them. I continued, my voice slicing right through the heavy, suffocating tension of the ballroom like a freshly sharpened razor blade. Greed is a highly predictable human flaw. While Julian was aggressively trying to illegally sell our proprietary predictive algorithm to our largest market rival, his loyal mistress was busy executing a secondary financial maneuver right inside my own Gold Coast penthouse. Marcus tapped his tablet a second time. The massive projector screen instantly transitioned to a secondary digital ledger. This specific document was heavily marked with the bright red flashing insignias of unauthorized internal corporate transfers. Early this morning, Savannah illegally accessed our rapid deployment corporate fund using stolen user authentication tokens. I explained, keeping my eyes entirely locked onto Julian. She confidently initiated a secondary wire transfer of exactly $2.5 million. She mistakenly thought she was building a comfortable financial safety net for their new luxurious life hiding in Europe. She even went so far as to secretly skim $400,000 directly off the top, routing it silently to a hidden Cayman Island trust account registered entirely under her own maiden name. She was aggressively stealing from the company, and she was simultaneously stealing directly from you, Julian. Julian aggressively snapped his head toward the VIP table, his eyes burning with absolute homicidal fury. Even in the exact middle of his own brutal public execution, his massive, fragile ego could not handle the undeniable proof that he had been completely outsmarted by his own junior accomplice. Savannah began to aggressively sob, shaking her head back and forth, desperately whispering that the ledger was a total fabricated lie. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, screaming into the silent room that I had completely manufactured the entire digital banking history. I turned my entire body fully toward Julian, stepping directly into his personal physical space, forcing him to look me squarely in the eyes. I wanted him to actively feel the absolute crushing weight of the trap completely closing around his throat. "You mistakenly thought you were a brilliant criminal mastermind, Julian," I stated softly, but the highly sensitive microphone caught every single lethal syllable perfectly. "You arrogantly thought you could purchase a synthetic paralytic on the dark web, casually forge a few medical documents, and walk away entirely unscathed with an $800 million corporate buyout. But you are absolutely nothing but a pathetic, mid-level real estate broker who fundamentally failed to understand the basic digital architecture of the massive empire you were actively trying to steal." The massive projector screen shifted one final ultimate time. The standard commercial banking ledgers were entirely replaced by a highly classified federal reporting dashboard. The bright gold official seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission entirely filled the 50-foot screen, hovering directly over Julian's head like a massive digital guillotine ready to drop. I did not secure my secondary corporate funds in standard commercial banking accounts. Julian first carefully explained, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm and entirely steady register. "Because my intelligence firm handles classified predictive analytics for the Federal Defense Department, my rapid deployment funds are hardwired directly into a federally monitored network. It is a highly classified digital architecture designed specifically to track and violently trap international cyber criminals. It is a highly secure digital honeypot." Julian stopped breathing entirely. The blood instantly drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost. The terrifying realization of what he had actually physically done was finally beginning to completely penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. I leaned significantly closer to the microphone, delivering the absolute final, devastating blow. "You did not just steal $15 million from your wife, Julian. You transferred it through an SEC flagged account. That $2.5 million, Savannah skimmed, that was federal bait money. You did not rob me. You robbed the United States government." The silence that rapidly followed was absolute and profoundly heavy. It was the exact sound of a man's entire existence, completely evaporating into thin air. Julian was no longer facing a messy local domestic divorce proceeding or a lengthy civil litigation over divided marital assets. He was staring directly at multiple consecutive counts of Class A federal wire fraud. He was looking at aggravated identity theft against a federally protected financial entity. He was completely looking at an automatic mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary simply for touching that specific flagged money. And that massive sentence was entirely calculated before the Federal Department of Justice even factored in the premeditated attempted murder charges. Julian completely collapsed. His knees physically gave out entirely beneath him, and he crashed heavily onto the carpeted wooden stage. He did not even try to stand back up. He knelt there completely paralyzed, in his custom-tailored Italian suit, staring blankly at the polished floor, completely permanently shattered. The massive $800 million buyout he had arrogantly planned was entirely gone. The $15 million he had violently stolen was completely locked down and frozen by federal authorities. The $10 million Manhattan luxury penthouse he constantly dreamed of buying was a total, absolute hallucination. His actual liquid net worth was exactly zero. Down at the VIP table, Savannah was completely violently hyperventilating. She aggressively tore the $85,000 diamond necklace directly from her throat, as if the heavy jewels were actively burning her skin. She violently threw it onto the marble floor, her chest heaving as she finally realized the absolute monumental scale of her own profound stupidity. She had physically executed the federal transfers. She had confidently pushed the digital confirmation buttons. She had physically injected the potassium chloride directly into my arm. She was going to spend the absolute rest of her natural life locked inside a concrete cell, wearing a scratchy, bright orange jumpsuit instead of a $10,000 designer silk gown. I stood perfectly tall behind the mahogany podium, looking out over the massive sea of shocked executives and absolutely terrified investors. I had not shed a single emotional tear tonight. I had not raised my voice in uncalculated anger. I had simply applied absolute relentless pressure using the exact concrete receipts they had so carelessly generated. I had built my entire successful career deeply analyzing complex behavioral data to perfectly predict catastrophic corporate failures. Julian had undeniably been the absolute easiest behavioral model I had ever mapped. I successfully predicted his blinding greed. I successfully predicted his massive arrogance. And I had ruthlessly used both of those massive character flaws to expertly engineer his total, absolute destruction. The heavy financial guillotine had finally fallen, completely severing him forever from the incredibly luxurious world he falsely thought he owned. The suffocating silence in the Sterling ballroom was suddenly shattered by the heavy rhythmic sound of synchronized footsteps echoing from the main marble corridor. The massive 10-foot-tall solid oak double doors that I had just walked through violently swung open for a second time tonight. They did not open for another dramatic corporate entrance. They opened for the absolute physical destruction of my husband's entire life. A highly coordinated team of 12 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed squarely across their broad backs marched directly into the massive room. They completely bypassed the terrified catering staff and entirely ignored the stunned wealthy guests sitting frozen at their white linen tables. They moved with absolute lethal military precision, forming a massive dark physical perimeter around the exclusive VIP seating area. The lead supervising agent, a tall, heavily built man with cold, entirely uncompromising eyes, stepped directly toward the front of the elevated stage. The terrifying reality of the massive federal trap I had meticulously built had officially arrived in physical form, completely ready to violently dismantle their fraudulent existence. Savannah saw the federal windbreakers rapidly approaching, and her entirely manufactured corporate composure instantly shattered into a million pathetic, jagged pieces. She did not even attempt to maintain her false dignity. She completely abandoned the elegant posture of an ambitious junior executive and rapidly devolved into a terrified, desperate coward. As two federal agents approached her with heavy steel handcuffs already drawn from their tactical belts, she violently pushed herself away from the mahogany table, knocking her expensive dining chair completely backward onto the floor. She aggressively backed herself into a massive custom floral arrangement of white orchids, physically crushing the expensive, delicate petals against the wall behind her. "Do not touch me," she screamed, her voice echoing hysterically across the entirely silent ballroom. "I did not plan any of this. It was Julian. He is the one who made me do it. He aggressively bought the synthetic poison on the dark web using untraceable cryptocurrency. He told me to heavily forge the medical proxy documents. He physically forced me to push the lethal injection into her intravenous line this morning." Savannah was physically pointing a violently trembling finger directly at the man she had intimately conspired with for the last 8 long months. She eagerly traded her absolute loyalty for a desperate, entirely useless attempt to save her own life. She loudly confessed to premeditated attempted murder and massive federal wire fraud right in front of the entire Chicago financial district, begging the federal agents to understand that she was simply a manipulated victim of his massive greed. The lead agent did not even blink at her pathetic performance. He aggressively grabbed her by the arm, spinning her around forcefully. The heavy, cold steel cuffs ratcheted shut around her wrists, biting deeply into her skin, right where her $85,000 stolen diamond bracelet had rested just moments before. Savannah collapsed heavily to her knees, sobbing completely uncontrollably, completely ruining her $10,000 designer silk gown on the cold, hard marble floor as the agent loudly read her the federal Miranda warning. Julian actively watched his junior mistress completely surrender to the federal authorities, and his basic primitive flight response completely took over his brain. He was a pathetic, cornered coward who had entirely run out of manipulative leverage. He did not gracefully accept his total, absolute defeat. He abruptly scrambled backward away from the heavy mahogany podium, violently slipping on the highly polished wooden stage. He jumped awkwardly off the side of the elevated platform, completely bypassing the carpeted stairs entirely, and sprinted desperately toward the swinging kitchen service doors, located at the far left side of the massive ballroom. He actually stupidly believed he could outrun a sealed federal indictment. He arrogantly thought he could rapidly escape into the dark downtown Chicago streets and somehow secretly access the Cayman Island trust accounts from a cheap, untraceable burner phone. But I had meticulously designed every single precise angle of this exact trap, and I absolutely never leave any exits unlocked for my enemies. He made it exactly 15 feet before his pathetic escape was violently, permanently intercepted. Marcos did not even have to move a single muscle. My private corporate security team, composed entirely of highly trained former military operatives, had seamlessly blended into the catering stuff all evening, pouring expensive wine and completely blending into the background. Two massive men wearing crisp white waiter uniforms aggressively stepped directly into his desperate path. They did not gently detain him or politely ask him to surrender. They physically tackled him with maximum aggressive force, driving his shoulders violently into the imported marble floor with a sickeningly loud, heavy thud. The custom-tailored Italian suit he arrogantly bought with my stolen corporate money tore violently at the expensive seams. Julian let out a pathetic, sharp gasp of absolute pain as all the oxygen was forcefully driven directly from his lungs. He struggled weakly against the absolute massive crushing weight of the security personnel, pinning him flat to the ground, but it was entirely absolutely useless. The federal agents immediately swarmed his position aggressively, pulling his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs permanently locking around his wrists was the absolute most deeply satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I slowly descended the carpeted stairs from the main stage, walking with absolute perfect predatory grace. I did not rush my movements. I took my absolute time approaching the massive, pathetic pile of absolute failure currently pinned to the ballroom floor. Julian was breathing heavily, his perfectly styled hair completely ruined, and his expensive face pressed awkwardly against the cold stone tiles. The federal agent roughly hauled him up to his knees, dragging him completely upright, so he was physically forced to look directly up at me. At that exact synchronized second, a sharp, distinct buzzing sound vibrated violently from the inner breast pocket of his ruined suit jacket. It was his personal encrypted cell phone. I looked directly at the lead federal agent and gave a highly subtle, commanding nod. Pull his phone out. I firmly instructed, my voice entirely smooth and terrifyingly calm, carrying no emotional weight whatsoever. Let him explicitly look at the digital screen before you permanently drag him out of my building. The federal agent reached into Julian's pocket, retrieved the glowing mobile device, and held it up exactly 4 inches from his terrified, bloodshot eyes. Julian forcibly focused his completely panicked eyes on the bright digital notification displayed squarely on his illuminated lock screen. It was an automated high-priority security alert from his primary personal banking institution. The exact financial institution where he arrogantly kept his personal checking accounts, his pathetic mid-level real estate business capital, and his entire supposed accumulated life savings. The digital text message was incredibly simple and absolutely utterly devastating to his massive ego. Notice of immediate federal asset seizure. Account status permanently frozen by the United States Department of Justice. Available balance exactly $0.00. I stood exactly 1 foot away from him, perfectly absorbing the absolute total destruction of his entire fraudulent reality. You mistakenly thought you could easily steal my massive empire. Julian, I stated coldly, looking deeply into his completely broken, defeated eyes. But you fundamentally forgot that I personally built the entire digital intelligence system you were aggressively trying to manipulate. Marcus officially filed the expedited federal asset forfeiture paperwork exactly 3 minutes ago. The federal government has formally seized every single penny tied to your social security number and your fraudulent corporate shell identities. Your pathetic real estate equity is completely gone. Your personal investment portfolios are permanently frozen. Your hidden offshore cryptocurrency wallets have been entirely drained by my forensic auditing team. You have absolutely nothing left in this world. You are permanently entering a maximum security federal penitentiary as an absolutely bankrupt man. Julian stared blankly at me, his jaw physically trembling with absolute pure, unadulterated shock. The absolute terrifying total reality of his permanent situation finally crushed him completely. He had absolutely no money to hire a high-powered, expensive defense attorney. He had absolutely no hidden offshore funds waiting for him after he served a mandatory 20-year prison sentence. He had absolutely nothing left but the torn, ruined suit on his back and the massive, insurmountable federal criminal charges waiting for him at the downtown precinct. He slowly opened his mouth, attempting to say something to beg for a tiny shred of completely unearned mercy, but his paralyzed vocal cords entirely failed him. I did not give him the immense satisfaction of hearing another single word from my mouth. I simply turned my back on him entirely dismissing his pathetic existence from my life forever. I walked smoothly over to a terrified young waiter standing completely frozen near the VIP table, holding a silver tray of expensive drinks. I calmly reached out and picked up a tall crystal flute of perfectly chilled, expensive, vintage champagne. I took a slow, deliberate, highly satisfying sip, relishing the absolute crisp perfection of the expensive wine. "Take them completely out of my sight," I loudly commanded without ever bothering to look back over my shoulder. The federal agents aggressively grabbed Julian and Savannah by their arms, forcefully marching them out of the massive oak doors in a highly humiliating, incredibly public walk of absolute total shame directly through the silent, crowded lobby. I stood completely alone at the absolute front of the spectacular ballroom, taking another calm, highly calculated sip of my champagne, perfectly ready to immediately resume absolute total executive control of the massive corporate empire I had built with my own two hands. Exactly 7 days after the spectacular collapse of my husband's pathetic criminal conspiracy, I sat perfectly upright behind the massive custom mahogany desk in my corner executive suite. The panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered an absolute commanding view of the Chicago skyline. The morning sunlight reflected brilliantly off the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Just 1 week ago, I was completely trapped inside a rented medical bed in my own living room, unable to move a single muscle, while a toxic chemical paralyzed my entire central nervous system. I was forced to listen to a mediocre real estate broker and his junior mistress casually plot the liquidation of my life work and the incineration of my physical body. Today, the synthetic neurotoxin was entirely a memory. My biological metrics were operating at absolute peak efficiency. I was wearing a pristine white tailored silk blouse and a charcoal blazer projecting the absolute unquestionable authority of a chief executive officer who had just successfully navigated a highly lethal corporate and domestic assassination attempt. The air in the suite was crisp and perfectly climate controlled. I placed my hands flat against the cool polished wood of my desk, feeling the absolute solid reality of my massive empire completely secured, entirely under my absolute control. I had not shed a single emotional tear over the complete catastrophic end of my 8-year marriage. Sadness is an entirely useless human emotion when you are busy executing a hostile digital takeover of your own stolen assets. I felt nothing but the pristine clarity of absolute pure corporate victory. The heavy frosted glass door to my executive suite swung open with a smooth, silent glide. Marcus walked into the room carrying his signature-locked leather briefcase. My brother-in-law did not bother knocking. He had absolutely earned unrestricted access to my physical and digital presence. He looked incredibly sharp, wearing a dark navy tailored suit, his posture projecting the absolute ruthless precision of a senior forensic auditor who had just single-handedly dismantled an entire criminal syndicate. He walked directly across the thick carpeted floor and stopped right in front of my desk. He did not offer a warm morning greeting. He simply placed a thick stack of heavily stamped legal documents directly onto the center of my mahogany desk. The heavy paper landed with a deeply satisfying solid thud. These were not internal corporate memos. These were the finalized federal prosecution documents straight from the United States Department of Justice. Marcus sat down in one of the leather guest chairs, crossing his legs and fixing his dark, intense eyes entirely on me. The grand jury formally returned the indictments yesterday afternoon. Marcus stated, his deep voice completely devoid of any sympathetic emotion. The federal prosecutor did not offer Julian a single shred of leniency. He is currently sitting in a maximum security holding cell wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, completely isolated from the general prison population. Because we handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation the fully cloned terabyte hard drive, the pristine 18-minute audio confession, and the undeniable digital logs from the Securities and Exchange Commission honeypot, his public defender immediately realized they had absolutely zero legal leverage. Julian is formally facing multiple consecutive counts of Class A federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, massive corporate embezzlement, and premeditated attempted murder. The federal judge permanently denied his bail request due to his status as a massive flight risk. He has absolutely no access to any external capital because every single financial account tied to his social security number remains entirely, completely frozen by the federal government. He is completely, legally, and financially bankrupt. Marcus paused, tapping his finger against the leather armrest. Given the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud involving a federally monitored secure network, combined with the lethal nature of the dark web neurotoxin, Julian is facing exactly 25 years in a federal penitentiary, absolutely without the possibility of early parole. He will be an old, completely forgotten man by the time he ever breathes free air again. I slowly reached out and traced my index finger across the heavy embossed seal on the top legal document, perfectly absorbing the absolute magnitude of his permanent destruction. And what about his fiercely loyal accomplice? I asked, my voice entirely steady and completely cold. Marcus let out a short, highly cynical laugh. Savannah completely, violently turned on him the exact second the heavy steel handcuffs locked around her wrists in that ballroom. She sat in the federal interrogation room and sang like an absolute canary for 6 consecutive hours. She voluntarily handed over the exact passwords to the Delaware Shell Company portal and completely confessed to illegally routing the $400,000 into her hidden Cayman Island trust account. She aggressively detailed every single fraudulent medical signature she forged. In exchange for her complete total cooperation and her legally binding agreement to testify entirely against Julian in open federal court, the Assistant United States Attorney formally offered her a heavily reduced plea deal. She officially signed the paperwork this morning. She's taking a mandatory 10-year sentence in a minimum security federal prison. She thought she was going to be living in a $10 million Manhattan luxury penthouse wearing $85,000 diamond necklaces. Instead, she will spend the entire next decade folding laundry in a federal correctional facility. I nodded slowly, entirely satisfied with the incredibly bleak mathematical outcome of their massive greed. They had arrogantly tried to steal my entire corporate kingdom, and they had absolutely destroyed their own lives in the careless process. But the domestic cleanup was only a fraction of the total execution I had meticulously planned for today. I opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. I slid a secondary stack of corporate documents directly into the center of my blotter. These were not federal criminal indictments. These were immediate binding corporate termination papers. During the massive ballroom gala, Julian had arrogantly identified the exact 12 senior executives and board members who had eagerly agreed to sell my proprietary predictive algorithm to our largest market rival for $800 million. They had all cowardly sat at that VIP table, completely ready to bypass the 48-hour compliance audit, entirely willing to profit massively off my fabricated, untimely death. I absolutely refused to employ corporate traitors. I uncapped my gold fountain pen and began to violently, aggressively sign my name at the bottom of every single document. I systematically fired the chief financial officer who had blindly trusted Savannah's fraudulent accounting. I permanently terminated the vice president of operations who had eagerly backed Julian's massive illegal acquisition attempt. I entirely dissolved the massive stock options of every single board member who had failed to physically verify my medical incapacitation. I was completely gutting the senior leadership of my massive data intelligence firm with absolute surgical precision. They were all losing their massive salaries, their exclusive company vehicles, and their incredibly lucrative equity shares. By the time I finished signing the final document, 12 highly arrogant executives were completely legally stripped of their massive corporate power and permanently banned from the premises. I placed the cap back onto my gold fountain pen and looked directly across the desk at my brother-in-law. The company is completely physically purged of their toxic incompetence, I stated firmly. But I have a massive sudden vacancy in the executive suite. The previous chief financial officer was entirely blind to a massive internal digital heist. I require a senior executive who actually understands how to violently hunt predators and actively build highly lethal digital traps. I require a man who does not panic when the primary network is violently compromised. I pushed a pristine white corporate contract completely across the polished wood directly toward Marcus. I am formally offering you the permanent position of Chief Financial Officer for this entire data intelligence firm. Your starting base salary is exactly $2.5 million annually, combined with a massive comprehensive equity package and absolute unhindered operational control over the entire internal security architecture. Marcus looked down at the incredibly lucrative contract. He did not smile or offer a long emotional speech of profound gratitude. He was a highly efficient pragmatist. He simply reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a matte black pen, and signed his name aggressively on the dotted line. "I accept the position, Chief Executive Officer," he replied, his voice carrying the exact same heavy weight of absolute corporate authority. "We are going to lock this entire massive network down so tightly that absolutely nobody will ever be able to steal a single cent again." I entirely, completely agreed. I turned my custom leather executive chair to face the massive digital monitors securely mounted onto the wall directly behind my desk. The screens were actively displaying the live complex financial dashboard for my publicly traded technology firm. When Julian had aggressively initiated his hostile corporate takeover, the massive uncertainty had briefly shaken the volatile financial markets. But the absolute second I walked into that ballroom completely alive, projecting the absolute terrifying power of an incredibly ruthless chief executive officer who had just completely destroyed a massive federal conspiracy, the massive market sentiment violently, dramatically reversed. The wealthy investors did not see a vulnerable female victim. They saw an absolute corporate apex predator who was completely, entirely bulletproof. I looked directly at the bright green digital ticker scrolling rapidly across the top of the monitor. The massive market valuation of my data intelligence firm had aggressively skyrocketed. Our overall corporate stock price was currently up exactly 34% since the highly public federal arrests last week. We had generated billions of dollars in new massive market capitalization entirely overnight. Julian thought he was breaking me. He thought he was completely ending my massive successful career. Instead, his pathetic assassination attempt had explicitly proven to the entire global financial world that I was absolutely entirely indestructible. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, staring out at the beautiful Chicago skyline. I possessed a totally clean corporate executive board. I possessed a brilliant, highly lethal new chief financial officer. And I completely, entirely possessed my beautiful, absolutely massive empire. The incredibly heavy Iron Throne was permanently, entirely mine, and I had absolutely never felt so incredibly alive. People think a woman's silence means she's completely weak. They see a total lack of tears, and they immediately mistakenly assume a lack of strength. They do not realize that while they are loudly plotting her downfall, she's quietly buying the exact ground they stand on. Julian made the ultimate catastrophic mistake of confusing my patience with absolute vulnerability. He thought that because I was physically paralyzed in a hospital bed, my mind was equally incapacitated. He spent 8 entire months loudly manufacturing a completely fraudulent reality built entirely on stolen corporate funds and illegal black market chemicals. He operated entirely on pure unchecked ego. But true absolute power does not need to scream in a crowded primary bedroom. True power does not need to boast about buying luxury real estate or stealing millions of dollars in front of a junior executive assistant. True absolute power is incredibly quiet. It is the silent execution of a digital shadow network. It is the completely invisible forensic audit quietly tracking every single fraudulent transaction. It is the absolute total restraint required to lie perfectly still while the people who promise to love you actively inject a lethal poison directly into your veins. Julian and Savannah loudly dug their own massive federal graves because they were completely blinded by their own pathetic arrogance. They entirely failed to understand that the absolute most dangerous woman in any room is the one who refuses to react emotionally when she is viciously attacked. A highly intelligent woman does not waste her precious energy fighting over a broken marriage or screaming about a stolen diamond necklace. She simply gathers the absolute concrete receipts. She calculates the exact mathematical trajectory of the betrayal. She legally aggressively secures her massive financial assets, and she permanently removes the toxic threats from her existence entirely. I did not just survive a highly coordinated assassination attempt. I completely redefined the absolute meaning of a hostile corporate takeover. If you absolutely loved watching Julian and Savannah walk directly into their own massive federal trap, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. My absolute favorite part of this entire execution was intentionally letting them steal the $2.5 million so they would blindly trigger the securities and exchange commission honeypot alert. It was the absolute perfect digital bait. What was your favorite tactical moment of the story? Would you have possessed the absolute physical restraint to let them take the federal bait money? Or would you have aggressively blocked the digital transfer immediately? How would you have legally and completely destroyed a husband who tried to entirely steal your massive corporate empire? Drop your exact strategy in the comments below. Join our massive community of strategic thinkers who entirely appreciate the absolute cold beauty of a perfectly executed white-collar revenge. Thank you so much for tuning into our channel today. We absolutely love reading your brilliant responses. See you in the next incredible story.